had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. I wanted to get away from the noise of the city, away from people, away from the constant pressure of work and traffic and the same faces every day. I found a cabin listing online, one that sat deep in the woods, far from the main road. The photos made it look old but solid, a simple wooden place with a tin roof, a porch that faced a stretch of trees, and a small clearing in the back where someone had once built a fire pit. It seemed like the kind of place I could spend a few days in silence, just listening to the wind and my own thoughts. That was what I thought when I booked it. I had no idea how different the reality would feel once I got there. The drive itself felt endless. The paved road narrowed into a cracked two-lane, then broke into a dirt path with loose stones that kept kicking up dust in the rearview mirror. My car rattled over the uneven ground, and I started to wonder if it had been a mistake taking my small sedan instead of renting something meant for rougher roads. The trees on either side grew denser the further I went. They leaned in, closing off the sky, making the road feel more like a tunnel than an open stretch. The air felt different too. Heavier, cooler, damp in a way that seeped through the cracked windows. The farther I drove, the less I saw of anything man-made. No houses, no fences, no mailboxes, no signs. Just forest swallowing everything. When I finally reached the cabin, the relief of arriving was mixed with unease. The place looked exactly like the pictures, but there was something unsettling about seeing it in person. The wood was darker than I expected, weathered by years of storms and sun. The porch sagged a little, its steps creaking under my weight as I tested them. The windows were streaked with dirt, and the tin roof bore patches of rust. It wasn't falling apart, but it didn't feel cared for either. It gave off that sense of being forgotten, like it had been standing alone in those woods long before I showed up, and it would keep standing there long after I was gone. Inside, it smelled faintly of old wood and damp air. The interior was bare bones. One main room with a small table, a chair, a narrow bed against the wall, and a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. There was no electricity, no plumbing, no sign of comfort. Just four walls and a roof. That was what I had asked for, I reminded myself. Solitude, simplicity, but already my mind was noticing things that unsettled me. The lock on the door was little more than a thin latch. The windows had no curtains, just dusty glass that anyone outside could look through. The woods pressed so close on all sides that I couldn't see more than a few feet into them before everything dissolved into shadow. Even though the sun was still up, it was too quiet. No distant cars, no people, no signs of life other than birds somewhere high above and the occasional rustle of leaves when the wind pushed through. I unloaded my bag and set it on the bed. The silence grew heavier when I stopped moving. I kept thinking about how far I was from anyone else, how no one knew exactly where the cabin was except the rental company, and how little it would take for something to go wrong without anyone hearing about it. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I came here for isolation, and this was exactly what I had asked for. Still, the unease stayed with me. As the day stretched on, I tried to settle in. I gathered wood from the clearing and stacked it near the fire pit. I walked around the perimeter of the cabin, testing the ground, noting how soft and spongy it felt under my shoes from the damp soil. I noticed old tire tracks pressed faintly into the dirt near the edge of the trees, half erased by time and weather. They didn't look recent, but they looked newer than I would have liked. I told myself they were from whoever delivered supplies or maybe hunters passing through. Still, the sight of them made my stomach tighten. The sun sank early behind the trees, the shadows swallowing the clearing faster than I expected. By the time I lit a lantern inside the cabin, it already felt like night. The glass of the windows turned black, reflecting my own image back at me, making it impossible to see outside. That was when I noticed how exposed the cabin felt. I could stand in the light and be seen from the woods, but I couldn't see out. I thought about the latch on the door again and how little protection it offered. I told myself it was fine. Nothing was out there. It was just trees, just night. But I couldn't shake the thought that the cabin felt like a trap. Light spilling out, darkness pressing in, me boxed between the two. I tried to sleep, but the silence made it impossible. I could hear every tiny sound. The creak of the wood as it settled, the faint scratch of branches against the roof, the occasional snap of a twig outside. My mind kept twisting each sound into something deliberate, like footsteps or movement. At one point, I was sure I heard something brush against the side of the cabin. But when I sat up and held my breath, the sound was gone. Hours dragged by like that, me staring at the ceiling, ears straining, waiting for something I couldn't name. When I finally drifted into sleep, it was restless and thin. I woke up early, the gray light of dawn filtering weakly through the windows. My first thought was that I had survived the night, as if there had been something I needed to survive. The ground outside was wet from dew. I walked around the cabin again, and that was when I noticed it. A footprint in the soft dirt behind the cabin. It was faint, but it was there. Not mine. Vida Deepa. The tread didn't match my shoes. My chest tightened as I stared at it. I told myself maybe it was old, maybe left by whoever had been here last. But the soil looked freshly pressed, the edges clear, not yet blurred by rain or time. I stood there for a long time, scanning the ground, the trees, the shadows between them. The silence pressed even heavier now. I tried to shake it off, telling myself again and again that I was imagining things. I spent the day walking the trails near the cabin, gathering more wood, trying to keep busy. But I couldn't stop myself from glancing over my shoulder every few minutes, scanning the trees, listening for footsteps behind me. Each time I heard something, I froze. It was always just the wind or a branch falling. But each time it left my heart racing. That night was worse. The darkness felt thicker, heavier, as if the woods had grown closer. I lay in bed, staring at the black window glass, ears straining for every sound. And the sounds came, twigs snapping not once but several times. Soft, careful, spaced apart. My whole body tensed. I held my breath, straining to hear. The steps stopped. Silence stretched, pressing into my ears until it hurt. Then, faint but real, I heard it. The sound of something brushing against the wall outside, slow, dragging. I sat frozen, not moving, not even breathing. The sound went away after a moment, but I didn't relax. I stayed like that for hours until the sky began to lighten. When I stepped outside at dawn, the first thing I did was circle the cabin. This time I found more prints, clearer, several of them. Someone had been moving around the cabin during the night. The sight turned my stomach cold. Whoever it was, they had been close enough to touch the walls, close enough to look inside. I knew then that I wasn't alone out here. I never considered myself someone who could get lost in my own planning. I have always been careful, always meticulous. The maps were double-checked, the supplies were counted, and every step of my route was plotted and timed. I knew the area well, or at least I thought I did. I had grown up hearing stories from hikers and campers about isolated cabins deep in the woods, and for some reason, I always felt drawn to them. The appeal was simple. Solitude, being away from everything, testing your own ability to survive and manage discomfort in a controlled way. That was my idea of peace. Or at least it had been, until the trip that would become one of the most harrowing experiences of my life. The cabin was supposed to be isolated but accessible. A small, wooden structure built by someone who loved the forest, nestled between pines and oaks, away from the noise of cars and towns. According to the last GPS coordinates I had from a local hiking blog, it was about a 2-hour hike from the nearest dirt road. I arrived at the trailhead early in the morning, with a backpack stuffed with everything I thought I might need. Water, canned food, a small stove, matches, a first aid kit, batteries, and extra blankets. I wore my hiking boots, a heavy jacket, and carried a map as a backup. Everything felt normal, everything felt planned. The first hour of the hike was easy. The forest was quiet, but not in the eerie sense you read about in novels. Birds called, leaves rustled, and occasionally a small squirrel or rabbit would dart across the path. The sunlight filtered through the trees in sharp beams, and I felt a kind of peaceful calm I rarely experienced in daily life. I took pictures of a few moss-covered logs and some of the wildflowers near the trail, even though I knew I had more important things to focus on. The air smelled like pine and wet earth, the ground soft from recent rain. The terrain began to get steeper after an hour, and the path became more uneven. Roots and rocks jutted out at random, forcing me to watch my step carefully. My boots sank slightly in mud patches, and I had to move slower, but I welcomed the challenge. I had been told the last part of the trail would be the hardest. The blogger had warned about the final stretch, describing it as a narrow path that sloped steeply between two ridges, littered with loose rocks and tangled roots. I reached it just before noon, sweating despite the cool air. As I navigated carefully, I noticed that the forest felt quieter than before. Not unnaturally so, but the sounds of wildlife seemed to have dwindled. Birds had gone silent, no insects buzzed, and even the wind felt weaker. I attributed it to the dense canopy overhead, the kind of forest that swallows sounds. I told myself I was imagining it. The path became trickier, the footing less certain. One false step could send you sliding down a slope, possibly into a dense thicket of trees and underbrush. I moved carefully, sometimes using my hands to steady myself on roots or rocks. At one point, I slipped slightly on a mossy stone, scraping my palm. I cursed silently, checking the cut. It wasn't deep, just enough to sting, but it reminded me that even careful planning didn't make you invincible. I wrapped it loosely with a small bandage from my first aid kit and pressed on. By late afternoon, I began to see glimpses of the cabin through the trees. Relief washed over me, but it was mixed with a sense of tension I couldn't explain. The cabin was small, weathered, but sturdy. Its roof had patches of moss, and the wooden walls showed signs of age. A chimney rose slightly above the roofline, though there was no smoke, suggesting it hadn't been used recently. A small deck ran along one side, and a stack of firewood leaned against the wall, neatly cut. It looked untouched for a while, yet someone had clearly cared for it at some point. The surrounding forest made it nearly invisible from the path, which explained why the GPS coordinates had been so essential. I reached the cabin just as the sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon. Shadows stretched long between the trees, and the air grew colder. I dropped my backpack, taking a moment to breathe and enjoy the view from the small clearing around the cabin. There was a small creek nearby, water trickling over rocks. It wasn't much, but it promised a source for drinking water after filtration. I unpacked some supplies and began assessing the cabin. The door had a simple wooden latch. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and damp earth. Dust covered the floorboards, and cobwebs clung to the corners, but it was dry and seemed safe. I moved carefully, making sure the floor didn't creak dangerously, checking every corner. A single small room contained a fireplace, a table, and a couple of old chairs. A narrow staircase led to a loft above, likely intended for sleeping. I set my pack down and lit the stove. The fire flickered warmly, offering comfort and a small sense of security. I took a few moments to drink some water and eat a protein bar, watching the sunlight fade completely behind the dense trees. As night fell, the real isolation became apparent. The forest around the cabin transformed. Darkness was heavy, pressing against the windows, and sounds that were normal in the daytime became strange. A branch snapped in the distance, and I froze, listening. Nothing followed, no movement approached. My mind told me it was probably a deer or some small animal, but my body reacted like I had just heard a predator. I stayed near the fireplace, the orange glow providing warmth and light, but also highlighting every shadow. Sleep was uneasy. I felt watched, though I knew no one was there. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside, set my heart racing. At some point, I realized the latch on the door hadn't been fastened properly. I corrected it, but the unease lingered. The night passed slowly. I checked my watch multiple times, listening for the usual nighttime sounds. Crickets, owls, wind, but the forest was mostly silent. By morning, I was exhausted, not from exertion, but from tension. My nerves were frayed, every small noise amplifying fear I tried to suppress. The following day was supposed to be simple. I had planned to explore a little further and return in the evening. I started early, carrying my small backpack and map. The forest was calmer in the daylight, though I noticed it seemed unusually dense, as if the trees themselves pressed inward. The trail was faint, overgrown in areas, forcing me to navigate more carefully. I had a general sense of direction, but realized quickly that without the GPS, I could easily get disoriented. Hours passed. I was careful with each step, avoiding mud, roots, and uneven ground. I stopped occasionally to drink water, check my map, and rest. By mid-afternoon, I realized I had lost the trail. The landmarks I expected were gone, replaced by unfamiliar trees and rocks. Panic rose in me, though I fought to control it. I backtracked, trying to find something familiar, but the forest had swallowed the path. My mind raced with the realization that I might have underestimated the difficulty of this area. As the sun began to drop, shadows lengthened, and I found myself in a small clearing I hadn't seen before. The creek I had noticed near the cabin was nowhere in sight. My supplies were limited, and I knew I had to make a decision. Either try to find the trail before dark or stay put and hope for safety. I decided to keep moving, reasoning that visibility would be better while the sun was still up. Every step became more cautious, every noise more alarming. The forest had a strange stillness. It wasn't just quiet, it felt like it was holding its breath. By evening, I stumbled into a dense thicket where progress was nearly impossible. My clothes were scratched, hands bleeding from branches, and my boots coated in mud. The sun dipped below the horizon faster than I expected, leaving only a faint glow. I had no choice but to find somewhere to shelter. I remembered a slope I had passed earlier that might have had some natural cover. I crawled toward it, pulling myself over roots and rocks. Eventually, I reached a small overhang between rocks, enough to keep the rain off my head and provide minimal protection. I rested, exhausted, and shivered in the growing cold. Sleep came fitfully. Every sound, branch snapping, animal movement made my body tense. I imagined the worst, though I knew it was improbable. Still, in the dark, isolated forest, improbable felt very close to reality. Morning brought relief in the form of weak sunlight filtering through trees. I was stiff, sore, and hungry, but alive. I knew I needed to find the cabin. I focused on a single point, retracing my steps as carefully as possible. I looked for familiar markers, moss patterns on trees, and unique rocks. Hours passed, each moment testing my resolve and patience. Eventually, by mid-afternoon, I recognized a bend in the trail I had passed the previous day. My heart leapt, and I pressed on, moving faster now that I had a sense of direction. The forest seemed less threatening in daylight, though my awareness of danger had heightened. I had gone up to the cabin to be alone for a while. I wanted quiet and distance from the noise of the city, so I rented a small wooden place that sat on the edge of a forest, not far from a narrow lake. The cabin looked old but sturdy. It had a front porch, a small living space with a couch and a table, a kitchen tucked into one corner, and a single bedroom with a thin mattress. Behind it stretched tall trees that blocked out most of the horizon. The air was clean, heavy with the smell of pine. When I first arrived, I felt calm in a way I hadn't in a long time. The first days went slow and quiet. I woke early to the sounds of birds and went to bed when the last bit of light left the woods. I cooked simple food on the small stove, read books I had brought with me, and walked down to the lake in the afternoons to watch the water move in small, steady ripples. I kept the windows open most of the time, and the cool air moved through the rooms. The nights were darker than I was used to. Without streetlights or houses nearby, the blackness outside was full and heavy, and it pressed against the cabin walls like a weight. I tried not to think too much about that, and I reminded myself that I had come here for peace. But after a few days, little things began to disturb that sense of peace. The first thing I noticed was how quiet the woods became at night. At first, I thought silence meant safety, but then I realized it was too quiet. No crickets, no frogs, no owls. Only stillness that seemed to deepen with every passing hour. When I lay in bed, I could hear the sound of my own breathing louder than anything else, and the silence outside felt unnatural. I tried to sleep through it, telling myself it was just the isolation playing with my nerves. One evening, as the sun was going down, I saw something strange. From the porch, I looked out at the line of trees. Between two trunks, a shadow seemed to move. It wasn't an animal, I was sure of that. The shape was tall, still, almost like a person standing in the distance. I blinked, and when I looked again, the shadow was gone. I told myself I had imagined it. The light had been fading, and trees could easily look like figures if I stared long enough. I went back inside, shut the door, and tried to forget about it. But the next morning, I found tracks in the soft dirt near the cabin. They weren't animal prints. They were boot marks, deep enough to show the tread. They led from the treeline to the side of the cabin and then stopped, as if the person had stood there for a while before walking back into the woods. My stomach felt heavy when I saw them. Someone had been near the cabin during the night. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was a hiker who had gotten lost and wandered close by. Maybe it was a hunter passing through. The woods were big enough to attract all kinds of people. Still, the idea that someone had stood only a few feet from where I slept left me uneasy. That night, I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows. They were old but functional. I told myself that as long as they were secure, I would be fine. I tried to read before bed, but I couldn't focus on the words. Every sound made me pause and listen. The creak of the cabin walls, the wind brushing against the windows, the occasional snap of a branch outside. I fell asleep late with the lamp still on. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first, but then I heard it. A slow, dragging step on the porch outside. The wooden boards groaned softly under weight. Then silence. My body went rigid. I didn't move, barely breathed. A few seconds later, another creak. Whoever it was, they were right outside the front door. I stayed frozen for what felt like an hour, but was probably only a few minutes. The steps stopped. The night went silent again. I strained my ears, but I couldn't hear anything more. I didn't dare look out the window. I lay there, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it shook the mattress. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back into sleep, though it was restless and shallow. In the morning, I checked the porch. There were more boot prints, clear as day, leading up the steps and stopping right in front of the door. Whoever had been there had stood inches from the handle. I felt sick when I saw that. It was no lost hiker. Someone had come deliberately to my cabin in the night and stood outside for reasons I couldn't understand. For the rest of the day, I couldn't relax. I kept looking out the windows, half expecting to see someone in the trees. I considered leaving right then, packing up and driving back to the city. But part of me resisted. I told myself I was letting fear take control, that I had come here to get away, and I didn't want to give that up. So I stayed, though I couldn't shake the dread that had settled deep in me. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat on the couch with the lights off, listening. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the occasional crack of the old cabin wood. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard it again. The porch creaked. Slow steps, deliberate, moving back and forth. I gripped the edge of the couch and stared at the door. The steps stopped, and then there was a soft scrape against the wood, as if a hand had brushed over the surface. I sat there, rigid, waiting for something more, but after a long while, it went quiet again. The silence felt heavier than before. My mind raced. Whoever it was, they weren't just passing through. They were watching, testing, waiting. In the morning, I checked again. New prints covered the porch. A faint smear marked the doorframe, like someone had dragged their fingers along the edge. My stomach turned. I knew then that staying any longer wasn't safe. I started packing quickly, stuffing my clothes and books into my bag. I wanted to leave before night came again. But when I stepped outside to load my things into the car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the edge of the trees, half hidden in the shadows, was a pile of cigarette butts, crushed into the dirt. They were fresh. Whoever had been watching me had spent hours there, sitting in the trees and smoking while keeping an eye on the cabin. That was enough. I finished packing in a rush and threw everything into the car. I didn't even bother checking if I had left things behind. I just wanted to leave. I drove down the narrow dirt road as fast as I could, my hands gripping the wheel tight, my eyes flicking to the mirrors. The farther I got from the cabin, the easier it became to breathe, but the fear didn't leave completely. I kept thinking about the steps on the porch, the prints by the door, the cigarettes at the treeline. Someone had been out there for days, watching me, getting closer each night. I didn't know who they were or what they wanted, and I didn't want to find out. When I reached the nearest town, I stopped at a gas station. In the bright lights of the lot, surrounded by people and cars, I felt safer, but only just. The thought of what could have happened if I had stayed one more night followed me like a shadow. I never went back to that cabin. I told myself I had gone there to find peace, but all I found was proof that sometimes danger doesn't come with noise or warning. Sometimes it comes in silence, in the steady creak of boards under hidden feet, in the marks left behind by someone who doesn't want to be seen until it's too late. I had been planning the trip for months, carefully mapping out a weekend getaway to a remote cabin deep in the forest. I wanted silence, isolation, and the kind of peace that only comes from being completely away from towns, phones, and the constant hum of modern life. The cabin was tucked into a dense cluster of pines, a small wooden structure with a single bedroom, a kitchen, and a little loft above that served as a living area. It was old, weathered, and had that slightly musty smell of wood and forest that comes from being shut up for months at a time. I liked that smell. It made it feel real, like I had stepped into a space where time moved differently. I arrived late Friday afternoon. The drive had been long and quiet. The road narrowed as I left the highway, then became gravel, and finally, toward the last mile, a barely visible dirt track that twisted and turned through the trees. My car rattled and shook over the uneven surface, but I didn't mind. The isolation was part of the appeal. When I finally arrived at the cabin, the sun was low, slipping between the tall pines, casting long shadows across the moss-covered ground. The cabin looked smaller than I imagined from the photos, but it had character. Windows with cracked panes, a crooked chimney, and a front porch that sagged slightly on one side. I parked and stepped out, taking in the air. It was cold for this time of year, a crisp chill that clung to my skin. I unlocked the door, pushed it open, and entered. Inside, the air was stale but comforting. Dust motes floated in the fading sunlight that streamed through the windows. I set down my backpack and spent a few minutes walking through the cabin, running my hands along the rough wooden walls, peering into cupboards, and checking the small pantry. There was a stack of firewood neatly piled near the stone fireplace, an old cast-iron stove in the kitchen, and a single bed with a faded quilt in the bedroom. The loft had a worn sofa and a couple of chairs, and I imagined curling up there with a book. After unpacking, I set out to explore the area around the cabin. The forest pressed in from all sides, dense and quiet, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. I followed a narrow path behind the cabin that wound through the trees, noticing how thick the underbrush was. Birds called intermittently, a few squirrels darted through the branches, and the wind whispered through the pines. It was peaceful, but there was also a weight to the silence, an emptiness that made me hyper-aware of my own breathing and footsteps. By the time I returned, the sun had almost disappeared, leaving the forest bathed in twilight. I lit a fire in the fireplace, feeling the heat slowly chase away the chill in the cabin. I boiled water for tea and settled into the loft with a notebook, jotting down thoughts about the forest, the cabin, and the solitude I had been craving. It felt good to be alone, to hear only the creak of the cabin and the occasional snap of a branch outside. Night came quickly, and with it a deep, pervasive darkness that seemed to make the forest beyond the windows infinite. I lay in bed, the quilt pulled up to my chin, and listened. The wind picked up, rattling the window panes and making the chimney groan. Somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard the sound of water. A stream, perhaps, but it could have been my imagination. I felt the first stirring of unease, a slight tightening in my chest. The isolation that had felt so freeing during the day now carried a subtle tension. Around midnight, I woke to a noise that made me freeze. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, A scraping sound, like someone dragging something across the forest floor. My heart pounded. I lay still, straining to hear. The sound came again, slightly closer this time, then paused. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the rhythm didn't fit. It was deliberate, slow, careful, and it made me conscious of the fact that I was completely alone, far from neighbors or help. I got out of bed, quietly, and moved to the window. The moon had risen, spilling pale light through the branches, but I could see nothing moving. I strained my eyes, looking into the black forest beyond, but the shadows hid everything. The noise started again, this time from the other side of the cabin, near the stacked firewood. My stomach turned over. I considered calling someone, but there was no cell signal here. My phone said no service. I grabbed a flashlight and a small hatchet I had brought along for firewood, my pulse racing. I stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards cold under my bare feet. The forest was quiet again, almost oppressively so. I shone the flashlight around, the beam cutting through the trees. I saw nothing at first, just the familiar shapes of trunks and branches. Then I noticed a faint disturbance in the leaves near the edge of the porch. A small clearing, some leaves that looked recently moved. My heart sank. I spent the next hour cautiously walking around the perimeter of the cabin, sweeping the flashlight across the ground, checking every shadow and every corner. I found nothing unusual. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign of a person. But the feeling of being watched persisted. The wind rustled the trees, and I jumped at every crack or snap of twigs. Eventually, I returned to the cabin, bolted the doors, and sat near the fireplace with the flashlight on the floor beside me. I kept the hatchet close. I told myself it was just an animal. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, but I didn't sleep much that night. Morning brought some relief. The sun rose through the pines, bathing the cabin in warm light. I inspected the outside carefully and found only small animal tracks near the back of the cabin, nothing larger. The sense of fear from the night before lingered, but daylight gave me courage. I decided to make the best of the day. I chopped some firewood, prepared breakfast, and then ventured further into the forest, trying to shake the memory of last night. The day passed uneventfully. I explored a nearby trail, found a small creek where I washed my face and filled my water bottle, and took note of landmarks that might help me find my way back if I wandered too far. The forest was stunning, filled with sunlight, bird calls, and the smell of damp earth. I felt a sense of accomplishment in navigating the terrain, and by evening, I was more relaxed. I lit the fireplace again, cooked dinner, and read until late. But the second night brought new unease. The wind was stronger, rattling the cabin. Around 11 p.m., I heard the scraping sound again, this time followed by a faint thumping, like footsteps on soft ground. My chest tightened. I couldn't see anything from the window. I considered staying in the loft, but my instincts told me to remain on the ground floor where I had an exit. I grabbed the hatchet, a flashlight, and quietly checked the doors. They were all secure. The noises persisted intermittently through the night, sometimes near the porch, sometimes in the shadows behind the cabin. Every time I thought I had fallen asleep, a new sound jolted me awake. By the third day, I realized the situation could no longer be ignored. I had brought supplies for a weekend, but now I had to think practically. I could leave the cabin, but the forest around it was dense and unfamiliar. There were no clear roads nearby, only faint paths through thick undergrowth. I resolved to wait until daylight and hike out to the main road, sticking to landmarks I had noted on the previous day. That morning, I packed quickly, leaving no trace behind. I took extra water, secured the hatchet, and moved cautiously through the forest. Every snapped twig made me flinch. Every shadow seemed larger than it was. My mind was tense, my senses sharpened. I moved slowly, checking each step, and avoided overgrown areas where I could not see clearly. After hours of careful walking, following the creek and the markers I had noted, I finally reached a gravel road. Relief flooded through me. I saw a car in the distance, driving slowly along the road. I waved frantically. The driver noticed me, stopped, and offered a lift to the nearest town. I accepted immediately, leaving the cabin and the forest behind. Once I was safe in the town, I reflected on what had happened. The scraping and thumping noises were likely caused by someone else using the forest near the cabin, though I had no way of knowing who. It could have been a hunter, a trespasser, or simply another hiker, but the fact that they had come close enough to circle the cabin at night made it real and threatening. I realized the cabin's isolation was both its charm and its danger. Being alone in such a remote place meant that help was far away, and any unknown presence, human or animal, could be dangerous. I never went back to that cabin. I learned to respect the balance between solitude and safety, understanding that isolation amplifies even ordinary sounds into something frightening. In the end, the fear I felt in those nights stayed with me for years, but so did a sense of accomplishment. I had faced a situation where I was truly alone and vulnerable, and I had navigated it with care and caution. I returned to the forest later, but only to areas with clear trails, cell service, and the presence of other people. I had been planning the trip for months, checking the weather, mapping the trails, and reading every review I could find about the small rental cabin tucked deep in the forest. The idea was simple: escape from the city, get a few days alone with nature, and disconnect from the endless hum of traffic and notifications. When I finally drove up the winding dirt road that led to the cabin, the forest closed in so tightly on either side that the sunlight barely touched the ground. The trees were enormous, with thick trunks and leaves that formed a dark, shifting canopy overhead. There was a quiet so profound it felt almost wrong, the kind of silence that made your ears ache after a while. The cabin itself looked smaller than I had imagined from the photos online. It was made of dark, rough-hewn timber, with a sloping roof that almost disappeared into the surrounding trees. Moss grew in thick patches along the roof and walls, and the windows were clouded with dust. Despite its neglected appearance, there was something solid about it, a stubbornness that seemed like it had resisted time and decay. I parked my car on the narrow strip of flattened earth in front of it, turned off the engine, and listened. The only sounds were the occasional bird, the distant rush of a stream, and the faint, almost imperceptible creak of the cabin settling. I unpacked slowly, placing my bag on the wooden floorboards, feeling the grain rough beneath my fingers. Everything felt exaggeratedly loud in the silence. The soft thump of my boots on the steps, the scrape of the zipper as I opened my bag, the faint rustle of leaves outside. I unpacked enough to make the place livable for the first night, leaving most of my supplies tucked in the car. Then I walked around the cabin, inspecting it. The door had a sturdy iron latch. The windows, though dirty, could open. There was a fireplace, now filled with cold, gray ash, and an old wood stove in the corner. It had been years since anyone had lived here for more than a few days at a time. The cabin smelled of damp wood and the faint, lingering musk of old smoke, like it had been closed off for a long time. Night was approaching fast. I decided to light the stove. I found some dry kindling in a metal box near the wall, along with a few pieces of split wood. The first few matches took forever to catch, but finally, a small flame flickered and then grew, crackling in the stove and filling the room with warmth. I sat back against the wall and listened to the sound of the fire, thinking about how alone I really was. The forest outside was nearly pitch black, only faint shadows moving in the corners of my vision. Every branch scraping against another sounded like a footstep. My pulse started to pick up without me noticing, my mind filling with small, impossible sounds. The whisper of leaves, a tap against the wall, the thud of something falling. I convinced myself it was all normal. Animals, wind, my imagination. I had been alone in the woods before and survived without problem. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That first night passed slowly. Every small noise felt amplified. A squirrel knocked something over outside, and my heart jumped. A branch brushed against the cabin wall, and I froze, staring at the window until the movement stopped. I forced myself to sleep eventually, though even in the dark, I could feel the walls pressing close, the weight of the forest holding me in. The next morning, I went for a walk, I needed to check the water supply and find firewood for the stove. The path that led away from the cabin was narrow and overgrown, the kind of trail that hadn't seen much use in years. I had my backpack with essentials: water, a small first aid kit, a map, a flashlight, and a knife. Everything else I had left in the cabin. As I walked, I noticed broken branches on the path, footprints that weren't mine, and places where the soil looked freshly disturbed. At first, I thought it might be deer or raccoons. Then I realized some of the footprints were too big, too heavy, too human. My pulse quickened, but I told myself it was impossible. Who would be this deep in the forest? And why would anyone be walking near an abandoned cabin? The thoughts made me uneasy, but I continued, determined not to let fear control me. By mid-afternoon, I had gathered enough firewood and had inspected the small creek nearby. The water was clear, icy cold, and fresh, trickling over smooth stones and mossy roots. I filled my bottles and drank deeply, grateful for the cool, clean water. On the way back, I noticed more footprints, and this time they were closer to the cabin. I hurried, each step crunching loudly over the leaf-strewn ground. I reached the cabin and double-checked the door locks. Everything seemed fine, but I stayed on edge. The forest had a way of closing in around you, and I knew that even a locked door didn't always feel safe when you were completely alone. Over the next few days, I tried to settle into a routine. I chopped wood, fetched water, cleaned the cabin as best as I could, and even built a small fire pit outside. I ate simple meals, slept when I was tired, and walked the forest during daylight hours. But the feeling never went away, the sense that someone or something was observing me. At times I thought I caught glimpses of movement beyond the trees. A shadow darting between trunks, a figure standing still just out of sight. Each time I looked, there was nothing. I told myself it was paranoia, that the isolation and silence had my mind playing tricks. Still, I couldn't stop checking the windows before bed or listening carefully to the sounds outside. Then, one morning, I woke to find the door slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it the night before. Panic surged, but I reminded myself I had secured it. Perhaps the wind? No, it was too still for the door to move. I inspected the cabin thoroughly, checking every lock, every window. Nothing seemed missing. Nothing seemed disturbed inside. But outside, the footprints had increased. They led away from the cabin and disappeared into the deeper woods. Someone had been here while I slept. The realization made my stomach churn. I stayed close to the stove that day, keeping my knife within reach. I didn't leave the cabin. Every sound made me flinch. Every shadow made me tense. I couldn't tell if my nerves were justified or if they were merely amplifying normal forest noises. On the fourth night, the situation escalated. I woke to the sound of something scraping the cabin wall. I froze, straining to hear over the thrum of my own heartbeat. The sound repeated, slow and deliberate, moving around the corner of the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, creeping toward the door. I held my breath and opened it slowly. The night was still. Nothing moved in the shadows. The footprints, however, were unmistakable, fresh, muddy, and heavy. Someone had circled the cabin, and they had been here recently. I realized that this was no longer a matter of imagination or fear. Someone had been inside my temporary home, watching me. The thought made my hands shake. I felt exposed, trapped, vulnerable. I wasn't in the city anymore. I had no neighbors, no streets, no help. Just the dense, silent forest and someone, somewhere out there, who might be waiting. That night I didn't sleep. I stayed by the fire, flashlight in hand, watching every window, listening to every sound. Hours passed like minutes. The forest seemed alive with movement, shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. When dawn finally broke, I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed quickly, trying not to make noise, checking every corner of the cabin for signs of someone hiding. There were none. Still, the tracks outside were clear. Someone had been there and they had come back during the night. I left the cabin, keeping to the small road, backpack tight against my shoulders, eyes scanning the trees. The forest felt oppressive, almost suffocating. I moved quickly but carefully, making sure to watch every shadow, every branch. The further I walked, the more the forest seemed to close in, thickening around me like a tunnel. It was exhausting, physically and mentally. By mid-afternoon, I reached a larger trail that eventually led to a main road. Relief washed over me when I saw a car in the distance. I ran toward it, waving my arms, heart hammering. The driver stopped, startled, but didn't ask questions. I climbed in and told them I needed help, explaining that I had been staying in a cabin deep in the forest and had seen footprints, someone following me. They didn't say much, just nodded and started driving toward the nearest ranger station. When I finally reached the station, I explained everything in detail. They listened, took notes, and promised to investigate the cabin. They told me that the area had occasional reports of trespassers, sometimes people camping illegally, sometimes worse. I didn't want to hear it. I only wanted the safety of other people around me. The thought that someone could have been living near my cabin, watching me, possibly planning to return, was terrifying. In the weeks that followed, I returned home but couldn't shake the memories. The forest, the cabin, the silent foot. I had been planning the trip for months, meticulously picking a cabin in the remote northern woods that promised solitude and the chance to be completely alone with nothing but my own thoughts. I had no desire for crowds or city noise. The idea of spending a week in a place where the nearest neighbor was miles away was exactly what I wanted. The cabin was small, old, and rustic, perched on a slight rise with a clearing around it. Pine trees surrounded the property, so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground in some places, and the air smelled like damp earth and pine sap. It was early autumn, and the forest was in transition, the green of summer fading to the yellows and oranges of fall. I had packed everything I thought I would need: food, water, firewood, a first aid kit, and extra blankets, but I tried not to overthink what could go wrong. I liked being prepared, but I also liked believing that everything would be fine. The drive-in had taken longer than I anticipated. The gravel road leading up to the cabin was narrow, twisting, and full of potholes, with low-hanging branches scratching at the edges of my car. Every so often, the road would open into a small clearing, and I could see a stream or a small patch of fields, but mostly it was just forest, unbroken and silent. There were no other cars, no houses, and no signs of civilization for miles. As I approached the final turn leading directly to the cabin, I felt a strange sense of isolation that made my stomach tighten. The clearing surrounding the cabin was larger than I expected, but it was overgrown. Tall grasses and weeds grew up to my knees in some areas, and the path leading from the small parking spot to the cabin itself was just dirt and scattered rocks. There was no mailbox, no signage, no indication that anyone had been here recently. I parked, got out, and the quiet hit me immediately. It was the kind of silence that isn't just the absence of sound. It presses against your ears, the forest itself holding its breath. I dropped my bags, took a deep breath of the crisp air, and started toward the cabin. The cabin was built from rough logs, the wood weathered and darkened by decades of exposure. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the windows were dusty but intact. There was a small porch with 2 chairs that looked like they had been abandoned years ago, their paint peeling. The door creaked loudly when I pushed it open, and inside, the air was musty and cold, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke from some long-past fire. The cabin was small, one main room with a wood stove in the corner, a tiny kitchenette along one wall, and a narrow staircase leading to a loft where the sleeping area was. I set my things down and started unpacking, arranging food and water in the kitchenette, stacking firewood near the stove, and checking the loft. The bed was a simple mattress on a wooden frame, and the blankets smelled faintly of dust and old pine. The windows had curtains, thin and yellowed with age, but they blocked the view only partially. I noticed the glass was slightly foggy, as if sealed with years of condensation. The first night, I made a fire and cooked a simple meal. The flames filled the room with a faint orange glow, and the shadows cast by the logs on the walls seemed alive, twisting and stretching across the cabin in ways that made me slightly uneasy. I read for a while, sitting in one of the old chairs with my back to the fire. The forest outside was black, almost unnaturally so, and the occasional sound of an animal moving through the underbrush made me tense. It was nothing I hadn't expected. I knew the woods were full of wildlife, deer, raccoons, maybe even a fox or two, but the silence in between the sounds felt unnatural. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that my imagination was just exaggerating things. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every little creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch outside made me sit up in bed, listening. I reminded myself repeatedly that I was safe, that I was miles from any human threat, that the cabin was solid. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that there was something just beyond the edge of the clearing that could see me, waiting. When I finally did fall asleep, it was fitful and filled with dreams of moving shadows and whispering leaves. The following days were quiet, almost too quiet. I spent them hiking along the trails around the cabin, exploring the nearby streams and small hills, gathering firewood, and keeping myself busy with small projects. I marked paths with small rocks so I wouldn't get lost, and I tried to keep a strict schedule of waking, eating, hiking, and returning to the cabin before nightfall. I told myself it was a good way to stay sane, to maintain a sense of control in a place where there was no one else to enforce any rules. The forest was beautiful. The leaves crunched under my boots. The smell of pine and wet earth filled the air, and the sun dappled through the canopy in the mornings. Occasionally, I would see deer or a fox, small reminders that I wasn't entirely alone. But the deeper I went into the forest, the more I felt a kind of oppressive stillness, as though the trees themselves were watching. On the fourth night, something changed. I had gone to bed early after a long day of hiking and chopping firewood. The stove had burned out, and the cabin had grown cold, the shadows deeper and sharper in the corners. I was just about to drift off when I heard it, a faint scratching sound at the window. I froze. The sound was soft but distinct, like nails on wood. My first thought was an animal, a raccoon maybe, or a small bear, but the noise was coming from the side of the cabin that faced the dense forest. I held my breath, straining to hear. The scratching stopped, and I told myself it was probably nothing. I closed my eyes again, but the silence that followed was even more suffocating than before. Then it came again. Scratching, deliberate, moving slightly along the side of the cabin. My pulse spiked. I grabbed my flashlight from the nightstand and shone it toward the window. Nothing, just the blackness of the forest. I shone the light around the clearing, sweeping it slowly, but saw only the outlines of trees, the slight shimmer of leaves in the breeze. Sleep that night was impossible. Every rustle, every small sound made me sit up and point my flashlight toward it. I lay awake until dawn, listening to the forest slowly come alive with the calls of birds and the rustle of small animals moving in the undergrowth. The sense of being watched did not leave me. The next day, I decided to investigate. I walked around the perimeter of the cabin, looking for signs of what had made the noise. I found small scratches on the wood near one of the windows, thin lines etched into the surface. They didn't look like the work of a human tool, but more like claws. I realized that the sound must have been made by some animal, maybe a bear or a large raccoon trying to get inside. I tried to convince myself that it was a relief. The cause of the noise was natural, not human. Still, the feeling of unease lingered. I reinforced the window with extra boards I had brought, just in case, and made sure my food was stored tightly in the cabin so it wouldn't attract wildlife. That night, I slept better, though not well. The forest noises were now familiar, and I was able to tune out most of them. But the following day brought another challenge. While hiking deeper into the woods, I came across a patch of ground that had clearly been disturbed recently. Footprints, large and human-shaped, pressed into the soft soil. They were fresh, too, the edges still sharp, and they led in the direction of my cabin. My heart pounded as I followed them back to the clearing. There was no one there, but the thought that someone could have been in the woods, maybe watching the cabin, made my stomach churn. I considered leaving immediately, but it was late afternoon, and the nearest road was miles away. I resolved to be more cautious, to stay close to the cabin and to avoid wandering too far. The next night, I stayed near the windows, listening. Hours passed without incident, and I began to relax slightly. Then, Around midnight, I heard it again. Soft, deliberate footsteps outside the cabin. They circled the building slowly, stopping for a few seconds at intervals. My heart raced, and I grabbed the only weapon I had, a small hatchet I had brought for firewood. I didn't dare open the door, didn't dare move too quickly. The footsteps continued, slow, careful, patient. I realized that whoever it was, or whatever it was, knew I was inside. The fear that had been simmering all week boiled over. I considered calling for help, but there was no cell service. My mind raced through options, all of them grim. Eventually, the sounds stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn, clutching the hatchet, scanning the clearing and the edge of the forest. When I finally allowed myself to breathe, I stepped outside. There were no footprints, no sign of anyone having been there. Only the overgrown grass and the early morning dew. I realized that the tracks I had seen the previous day might have been old, misleading, or just a coincidence. Still, the fear stayed with me. Over the next 2 days, I fortified the cabin further, moved food indoors, and made sure I had a clear path to escape if necessary. I stayed inside as much as possible, using the daylight to explore the forest only briefly and cautiously. I remember the first moment I saw the cabin clearly in my mind, even now, years later. It was early September, and the air had a sharp bite to it that hinted at the coming fall. Cold enough that I pulled my jacket tighter around me as I stepped out of the car. The road leading up to the cabin was narrow and winding, cut through dense pine forest that stretched in every direction. Sunlight barely reached the forest floor, filtered through the thick, dark canopy. The gravel under my boots crunched loudly, the sound echoing unnaturally in the silence around me. That silence had its own weight, as if the forest was holding its breath. I had arrived alone, which was unusual for me. I often went on hikes and short trips, but this was my first trip to a cabin by myself. I had found it online, a small rustic cabin for rent tucked deep in the woods, advertised as secluded and perfect for disconnecting from everything. At the time, the idea of being alone was thrilling. I imagined sitting by a fire, reading, writing in my notebook, cooking my meals, and hearing nothing but the wind and the distant birds. But standing there, staring at the cabin partially hidden by overgrown bushes, I felt the first prick of unease. The cabin was older than it looked in the pictures. Its wooden exterior was weathered and streaked with dark stains, the roof sagging slightly in the middle, and the windows covered with a film of grime. I could see the remains of what had once been flower boxes beneath the windows, empty now, filled only with dead leaves and dirt. The door was solid, wooden, with a rusty latch that I had to force open. As it creaked and groaned, I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of mildew and old wood. Dust floated in the shafts of light coming through the windows, and the floorboards were uneven and warped in places. The kitchen was tiny, with a small counter, a sink that looked like it hadn't been used in months, and an old stove. I set down my backpack and ran my hand along the counter. It was sticky, covered in a thin layer of grime that had absorbed years of neglect. I didn't mind. I had expected it to be rough, and part of the appeal was that it wasn't some polished, artificial retreat. I started a fire in the small stone fireplace, using some kindling I had brought, and soon the room filled with warmth and the smell of burning wood. The sound of the crackling fire was comforting, but it didn't erase the quiet of the cabin. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the wooden walls settling, sounded amplified. I began unpacking slowly, trying to tell myself I was just tired from the drive. I explored the cabin further, moving from the kitchen to the small living space and then to the bedroom. The furniture was old, rough-hewn wood and covered in thin, faded fabrics. The bed looked uncomfortable, but it was clean enough. A small table sat near the window, and I placed my notebook there, looking out at the dense forest beyond. There was no road visible from the window, no sound of cars or people. For the first time in a long time, I realized how completely isolated I was. It should have been exhilarating, but instead, there was a sense of vulnerability I hadn't anticipated. I tried to push the feeling aside, reminding myself that isolation was exactly why I had chosen this place. Night fell faster than I expected. The forest outside became a wall of darkness, broken only by the faint moonlight filtering through the branches. I had brought a small lantern, but I left it unlit, wanting to feel the fire's warmth and glow. The shadows in the cabin lengthened and shifted as the fire flickered, and I noticed small details I hadn't before. The gaps in the floorboards, the dark stains in the corners, the faint scratch marks on the walls that looked almost like claw marks. I laughed quietly at myself for noticing such things, telling myself it was just the old wood and the settling of the building. I went to bed early, exhausted from the drive and the day's work. I lay under the thin blanket, the fire's light reaching the bedroom just enough to cast dim shadows. I closed my eyes, telling myself I would sleep well, but I didn't. First, it was small things. The wind outside shifted, and I could hear branches scraping against the roof. A sudden rustle, like an animal moving outside, made me sit up quickly, straining my eyes in the dim light. I told myself it was a deer or some small creature, but the rustling didn't stop. It moved, slowly and deliberately, circling the cabin, sometimes pausing as if listening. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to convince myself that the thick wooden walls were enough protection. Hours passed. I couldn't tell if it was still outside or if I had imagined it. Every sound seemed exaggerated in the silence. My heartbeat was loud in my ears, echoing off the wooden walls. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps on the porch. I froze, listening. Nothing. I waited, holding my breath, every muscle tense, but the sound didn't come again. I eventually forced myself to lie down, telling myself that I was safe, that this was just the nervousness of being alone in an unfamiliar place. I managed to drift into an uneasy sleep, waking periodically to check that everything was still as I had left it. The next morning, I decided I would explore the surrounding area. I had brought a map and a GPS, but the forest was dense, and I quickly realized that even a short walk could easily disorient me. I packed some food, water, and my notebook, and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and insects, but it was also silent in a way that was almost oppressive. I followed a narrow trail that looked as though it hadn't been used in years. The trail was overgrown with ferns and brambles, and I had to duck under low branches and step carefully over tangled roots. Every so often, I would catch glimpses of the cabin through the trees, a small, dark rectangle in the distance. As I walked, I began to notice signs that something else had been here. Broken branches, footprints that didn't look like mine, flattened patches of grass where someone, or something, had rested. I felt a growing tension in my chest. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or a fox, moving through its territory. But then I noticed the footprints again. They were human, small, narrow, and slightly deep, as if the person had been carrying weight. I stopped, staring at them, trying to make sense of it. The tracks didn't lead far, just a few dozen feet, and then they disappeared into the underbrush. I returned to the cabin quickly, my unease growing. I locked the door behind me, double-checked the windows, and tried to calm myself. I spent the rest of the day cleaning the cabin, organizing my supplies, and keeping the fire going. I told myself I was being paranoid. People didn't break into remote cabins in the middle of nowhere, did they? But the feeling of being watched persisted. Every shadow seemed darker, every sound sharper. I began to sleep lightly, keeping my phone and a small hatchet within reach. The second night was worse. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of the door creaking. I froze, straining to hear. A figure, or at least the sense of one, loomed in my mind, and my imagination filled in the gaps. I lay as still as I could, waiting for a sign that someone had entered. Nothing happened. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just the wind, and I forced myself to sleep again. The next morning, I found more signs outside. Footprints again, this time fresher, leading from the edge of the forest to the cabin and stopping abruptly at the porch. I checked the door and the latch. Everything was intact. I couldn't explain it. I felt trapped in a small, enclosed world, the forest pressing in on all sides. I spent the day preparing. I gathered rocks and sticks, set a few small traps around the perimeter, and stayed inside as much as possible. I rationed my food carefully, drinking only when necessary, knowing I might have to last longer than planned. By the third night, I had almost accepted that I was alone, that the noises and footprints were tricks of the mind and wildlife moving near the cabin. I ate sparingly, slept lightly, and kept the fire going at all times. But just before dawn, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps on the roof. Heavy, deliberate steps moving across the shingles. My first instinct was to hide, but there was nowhere to hide in a cabin that small. I grabbed the hatchet and waited, every muscle tense. The steps stopped, then started again, moving toward the edge of the roof. I realized with a mixture of fear and relief that they weren't persistent. They stopped, and then the forest went silent again. When the sun finally rose, I decided I couldn't stay any longer. I packed my things quickly, taking only what I could carry. I left the cabin as quietly as possible, stepping carefully over roots and fallen branches, making my way back to the road. I kept my eyes on the trees around me, expecting to see someone or something watching, but the forest remained still. When I reached the road, I found a passing car and flagged it down, grateful for the presence of another human. I had been planning the trip for months. The cabin was in a remote part of the forest, miles from the nearest town, tucked into a hollow beside a narrow stream that wound its way through dense trees. It was the kind of place that, on paper, promised peace and isolation. The kind of place where someone like me, who had spent the last year drowning in city noise and the endless hum of fluorescent lights, could disappear for a while. The road leading up to it was long and rough, a mix of gravel and dirt that shook my car violently and left a fine layer of dust covering everything inside. By the time I finally reached the small clearing where the cabin sat, it was late afternoon, and the sun was low, burning gold through the tops of the trees. The light made long shadows that stretched across the clearing, touching the sides of the cabin in strange, uneven patterns. The cabin was older than I expected. The wood was gray and weathered, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle, though not enough to suggest immediate danger. A thin wisp of smoke curled lazily from the chimney, which reassured me slightly, though I knew no one was supposed to be there yet. I carried my bag inside, the wooden floorboards creaking under my weight. Dust rose in small clouds as I set down my pack, and I coughed as it settled back down. The cabin smelled of old wood and pine, with a faint mustiness underneath, like it had been closed up all winter. There was a small kitchen with a stove and a fridge that hummed weakly, a single bedroom with a narrow bed and a wooden dresser, and a living area with a cracked leather couch and a tiny coffee table. The windows were thin, and the glass rattled slightly in the wind. I set to work unpacking and getting ready for my stay. I had brought food that didn't require refrigeration, a small camping stove, matches, a lantern, and extra batteries. I checked the fireplace and found a stack of firewood in the corner. The first thing I did after unpacking was light a small fire. Watching the flames lick upward, I felt some of the tension I had carried with me ease slightly. I could hear the forest around me, the creak of trees in the wind, the distant caw of a crow, the faint trickle of the stream. It was peaceful, exactly what I had hoped for. As evening approached, I cooked a simple meal and ate it while sitting on the couch. Outside, the shadows lengthened, and the forest began to hum with nighttime life. The sound of insects was thick, and the occasional rustle of leaves suggested small animals moving through the underbrush. I had brought a book, but I could not concentrate. There was a feeling of unease I could not shake. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, a sensation in the back of my mind that whispered something was off. I shook it off as nerves. Maybe I was just anxious because I was alone, miles from anyone else. Night came quickly. I moved to the bed and lay down under the thin blanket I had brought. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, rattling the windows and making the chimney smoke swirl erratically. I listened to the forest sounds, counting the small movements I could hear, the occasional snap of a branch, the distant hoot of an owl. Then, around midnight, I heard it, a soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps on the gravel outside. At first, I thought it might be a deer or a small animal, but the pattern of the steps was too deliberate, too heavy. I froze, listening. The sound stopped suddenly, as if the person or animal had noticed me. My heart rate increased, and I strained to hear anything else. The forest seemed to hold its breath. I debated what to do. I had no phone signal, of course, being this far into the woods, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. I considered getting up and checking, but something in me held back. I remembered that I had brought a hunting knife, small but sharp, which I kept tucked under my pillow. Slowly, I rolled onto my side and tried to make as little noise as possible. The footsteps began again, closer this time, moving toward the front door. My stomach dropped. I realized whoever it was, they knew someone was inside. I waited, listening to the movements. The wind outside was picking up, howling through the trees and making the windows shake. I could hear the steps pause at the front door. There was a long, tense moment when I thought they might leave, but then I heard the faint scrape of metal, someone trying the door handle. I had locked it, but I hadn't bolted it fully. Panic surged. My mind raced through every possible scenario. I thought about hiding, but the cabin was small and hiding would be almost useless. My only option, I realized, was to prepare for confrontation. I grabbed the knife and moved quietly to the kitchen, keeping low. I could hear the intruder trying the door again. Then, just as I readied myself, there was a sudden loud crack. The door splintered under a heavy blow, and I caught a glimpse of a shadow moving inside. I acted instinctively. I lunged, holding the knife with both hands. The intruder reacted, startled, and there was a struggle. The shadow fell, hitting the floor with a heavy thud, and I heard a groan. I could see the figure now. It was a man, scruffy and angry, trying to rise. I swung again, and he stumbled back toward the doorway. He was trying to get out, and I realized he might be desperate, dangerous. I yelled as loudly as I could, hoping someone would hear, though I doubted it. Then, as suddenly as it began, the struggle ended. The man ran off into the woods, limping, leaving the door partially splintered and the air thick with tension. I sank to the floor, shaking, trying to calm down. My heart was racing, and my hands were covered in splinters and sweat. I checked the cabin for further signs of intrusion. Nothing else had been taken, and there was no one else inside. I locked and bolted the door as best as I could, reinforcing it with a chair. I lit another fire, more to comfort myself than for warmth, and sat down on the couch, exhausted. I realized I would not sleep that night. I stayed awake, listening to the forest, every sound making me jump, every shadow stretching across the walls in eerie shapes. Morning came slowly. I was still exhausted but determined to leave. I packed my things quickly, my hands trembling slightly. Before leaving, I took careful note of the surroundings and the damage to the cabin. I could see footprints leading into the forest, but they disappeared after a few hundred meters. Whoever it was had not left any obvious signs of where they had gone. I got into my car and started the long drive back to civilization, checking the rearview mirror constantly, half expecting to see the man following me. By the time I reached the nearest town, I was shaken but relieved. I reported the break-in to the local authorities, giving them as much detail as I could remember about the man and his actions. They were understanding but cautious. They had heard of a series of burglaries in the area, targeting cabins like mine. The reality settled in. The isolation that had promised peace had almost cost me my safety. In the following weeks, I took extra precautions. I installed new locks, reinforced the windows, and set up a small alarm system. I stayed closer to towns, choosing cabins with nearby neighbors rather than deep in the forest. I realized that solitude, while tempting, came with risks I had underestimated. I also realized the value of preparation. Having tools, knowledge, and a plan could make the difference between a terrifying encounter and a fatal one. Eventually, I returned to the cabin one last time during daylight with someone else accompanying me. We assessed the damage and repaired what we could. The cabin was no longer the inviting retreat I had envisioned. It was a reminder of vulnerability, of the fragility of safety in places far from help. I left it repaired but rarely visited, knowing some lessons are best learned once. The experience changed me. I became more cautious, more aware of my surroundings, more deliberate in my choices. I never again took isolation lightly, but I also learned that survival is not about bravery alone. It is about preparation, awareness, and respect for the environment and the people who might disrupt it. In the end, I was lucky. I had faced fear, and I had survived with clarity. I kept that lesson with me, a quiet vigilance that shaped the way I approached life afterward. The memory of that night never fully left me. The creak of the floorboards, the shadow at the door, the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in the quiet. But I learned to live with it, to let it inform my actions without controlling them. That cabin, the forest, the intruder, all of it became part of my understanding of the world. Beautiful, wild, and occasionally dangerous. And in that understanding, I found not just fear, but resilience. I had always been drawn to the idea of being alone in the woods, a kind of quiet isolation that felt like it could strip everything down to the essentials: air, water, warmth, and survival. When I finally saved enough money, I rented a small, old cabin deep in the mountains. It was the kind of place you didn't find by accident, tucked behind miles of rough, unmarked trails, a structure built decades ago out of thick logs, with a steep, tin roof that had begun to rust at the edges and a stone chimney blackened with years of soot. It sat beside a small, shallow creek, the water moving slow and clear over moss-covered stones. No neighbors, no roads, no cell reception. I drove to the trailhead and walked for almost 2 hours with my backpack before I even glimpsed the cabin through the trees. First, it was everything I had imagined. The quiet pressed against me like a living thing. Birds moved through the trees overhead, squirrels darted along fallen logs, and the air smelled of pine, wet leaves, and soil. Inside, the cabin smelled old but clean. Dust covered the floorboards and furniture, but it wasn't the kind of dust that indicated decay. It felt like the dust of disuse, the kind left behind when a place was left alone and untouched. The furniture was basic but sturdy. A wooden table and chairs, a narrow bed with a thin mattress, and a few shelves lined with jars and old canned goods. A small wood stove sat in the corner, blackened with soot, and a pile of firewood rested against the wall. I unpacked my things slowly, taking in every detail. I had come prepared for solitude, and for the first night I was content simply to sit by the window and watch the forest, a cup of coffee warming my hands. The first few days passed quietly, but I began to notice small, unsettling things. At night, I would hear the scrape of branches against the cabin walls, the sound of feet or claws shifting through the leaves outside. I kept telling myself it was animals, deer, raccoons, the occasional bear, but the sounds were deliberate in a way that didn't feel right. I tightened the cabin door locks and made sure the windows were secured each evening. The creek, which had seemed peaceful, started to make a different kind of noise at night, the water hitting the rocks in sharp, abrupt rhythms, almost like footsteps or tapping. My mind tried to rationalize it, telling myself that the water was just reacting to some shift in the stones or the wind, but the feeling in my chest refused to settle. Something was out there. I kept busy during the day, chopping wood, carrying water from the creek, tidying the cabin, and taking walks along the narrow trail that led to the nearest ridge. The forest was thick, every step taking careful navigation over roots and loose stones. I brought a small axe, a hunting knife, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and a backpack full of supplies. But the isolation made me feel fragile in a way I hadn't anticipated. Every crack of a branch underfoot or rustle in the leaves was amplified, echoing through the trees. I felt watched. On the third night, it happened. I was in bed, awake, listening to the night around me. I heard a sound outside the cabin, faint at first, a careful, deliberate tapping on the wooden wall of the cabin. My heart started to pound, and I froze. I wanted to convince myself it was the wind, a loose branch, or an animal. But then it happened again, the tapping coming in measured intervals as though someone or something was testing the wood, assessing the structure. I grabbed my flashlight, swung it toward the window, and shined it into the darkness. There was nothing there. No movement, no shadow, just the dense forest, alive with the night sounds of insects and animals. I waited, listening, and eventually the tapping stopped. My mind spun with possibilities, all terrifying. I stayed awake until dawn, every creak in the cabin making me jump. The next day, I explored the perimeter of the cabin, looking for any signs of human presence. I found no footprints near the creek, no discarded items, nothing to suggest I wasn't completely alone. Yet the sense of being watched persisted. That afternoon, I discovered a small pile of broken twigs and crushed leaves near the edge of the treeline. I had made no mark like it, and the arrangement looked deliberate, almost like someone had paused there to observe. I felt my stomach tighten, a dull, steady fear that wouldn't go away. I tried to rationalize it again, telling myself that wild animals could be moving through the forest in strange ways, leaving little signs. But my instincts, honed from years of hiking and camping, told me this was different. Something was here, and it knew I was alone. I checked the locks again, reinforced the doors with furniture, stacked heavy logs across the windowsills. I didn't sleep well that night. By the fourth day, I had begun to notice changes in the forest itself. Branches along the trail were bent in unusual ways. Footprints I didn't recognize appeared near the creek, and the wildlife that had seemed so natural began to disappear. Birds went silent as I walked, squirrels fled, and the wind through the trees sounded harsher, more urgent. I started carrying my axe and knife constantly, moving quietly, watching the shadows. That night, the tapping returned, louder this time, more insistent. It wasn't just on the walls, but also on the roof. I felt panic rise in me as I realized that someone had found the cabin. I gathered supplies, my backpack, a small tent, my camping stove, water, and extra clothing. I told myself I was going to leave at first light, retreat to safety, but I didn't want to run blindly into the forest at night. I stayed awake, every sense alert, listening to the movement above and around the cabin. Morning came slowly. I waited until the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees before venturing out. I discovered footprints outside the cabin, large and heavy, unlike any animals. They led off into the forest but were too fresh to ignore. My stomach turned as I realized that someone had been near me, watching, waiting, maybe planning. I had no phone signal, no way to call for help, and the nearest road was miles away. I had to rely on my wits. Over the next several days, I devised a plan to leave. I moved quietly, marking the trail with subtle scratches on the trees, so I could find my way back if I had to, keeping the backpack and essentials ready. I hid the more obvious items in the cabin to avoid drawing attention. At night, I barricaded myself inside, but I kept a low profile, leaving no light that could be seen from outside. I learned the rhythms of the forest, noting every sound and movement, planning my path carefully. On the fifth day, I decided to leave. I waited until midday, the sun high and shadows short. I moved quietly, following a stream that led to a larger river, hoping it would guide me toward the main road. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees thick and unyielding, every branch a potential hiding place. I moved slowly, deliberately, avoiding dry leaves that could crack underfoot. Hours passed, and I started to feel exhausted. Hunger gnawed at me, and my water supply was low. Yet I couldn't stop. I had to get out before someone cornered me. As evening approached, I reached the river, moving along its edge, following the current downstream. The footprints had disappeared, but I didn't feel safe. I built a small, temporary shelter from branches, just enough to rest and hide for the night. I ate the food I had packed and drank sparingly. My body ached, my mind was on high alert, and sleep was impossible. I stayed awake, listening to the river, the forest, every sound magnified by tension. The next morning, I continued along the river, and eventually, after hours of careful movement, I spotted the glint of a road in the distance. I approached cautiously, knowing that visibility increased the risk of being seen if someone was still following me. As I emerged from the trees onto the roadside, a car passed slowly. I waved frantically, and the driver stopped. I collapsed into the vehicle, exhausted, trembling, barely able to speak. I was taken to a nearby town, where I contacted the authorities and reported the events. They investigated the area but found no evidence of anyone staying near the cabin. The forest reclaimed the signs, footprints erased by wind and rain, twigs reset to their natural positions. No one could explain what had been watching me or why, but the cabin was abandoned again, empty and silent. I never returned to the woods after that. The isolation I had once craved had turned into a trap, a constant, looming threat. I realized that some places, no matter how beautiful or serene, carry dangers that are invisible, deliberate, and human. In the end, I survived because I stayed calm, observed every detail, and relied on preparation and careful planning. I learned to respect the forest, not as a place of peace, but as a space where one's instincts must be sharp, where silence can be a warning, and where solitude can turn from serenity into fear in a matter of hours. I never forgot the feeling of being watched, the scraping sounds at night, the footprints that appeared and disappeared. It stayed with me for years, a reminder that the world can. I had been planning this trip for months, telling myself it would be a chance to escape the noise of the city, the endless emails, the constant hum of people demanding attention. I wanted silence, the kind of silence that isn't just the absence of sound, but something deeper, almost heavy, pressing against your ears and your chest until you realize how much you take for granted every small, everyday noise. The cabin I rented was supposed to offer that. It was deep in the woods, far from the nearest town, tucked into a small clearing with a narrow dirt road leading to it. The photos online made it look like a retreat from the world. A small, wooden structure with a stone chimney, a porch that wrapped around two sides, and large windows facing the dense forest beyond. The description promised peace, seclusion, and safety. I arrived in late afternoon, just as the sun was dipping behind the tops of the pines. The last mile of the road had been rough, potholed, and overgrown in places, forcing me to drive slowly. When I finally reached the clearing, I noticed how the air seemed to change immediately, thicker, cooler, carrying the scent of pine needles and wet earth. The cabin looked exactly like it had in the photos, but in person it seemed smaller and quieter, more isolated than I had imagined. There was no car nearby, no signs of other people, nothing beyond the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a distant bird. I parked and got out, stretching after the drive, and immediately felt the weight of solitude. The forest pressed in on the clearing, trees leaning in on all sides. I carried my bag up the creaking wooden steps and unlocked the cabin door. Inside, it smelled faintly of wood polish and dampness. The interior was simple: a small living area with a wood stove, a kitchenette, a bedroom tucked in the back, and a bathroom that seemed barely used. The furniture was basic, but clean, and the large windows offered a clear view of the forest, which seemed to swallow light the deeper it went. I unpacked quickly, setting down my bag, and decided to start a fire in the stove. The first match sparked, then went out, and I struck another. The flames caught finally, casting flickering shadows against the walls. Sitting down in the quiet, I felt a strange awareness of the room, of every corner and creak of the old wood. It was the kind of silence that feels like it's listening back. I told myself it was just the wind moving through the trees, the house settling. Rational thoughts, the ones that kept me sane in the city, felt heavier here, as if gravity were stronger. Night fell faster than I expected. The last light bled out over the tops of the trees, leaving the clearing in deep blue shadows. The forest became a wall of darkness, and I realized that from this distance, I could see nothing beyond the first few feet of undergrowth. I had brought a flashlight, so I went outside briefly to explore the perimeter. The ground was soft with fallen needles, muffling my steps, and every small sound seemed louder, from the crack of a twig to the distant drip of water somewhere unseen. I didn't venture far, turning back to the cabin after a few minutes, reassured by the familiar outline of the porch and the warm glow of the stove through the windows. Inside, I tried to settle in for the night, I checked my phone, no signal, just as the listing had said, and the realization hit me with a small rush of anxiety. Alone, in a forest, with no one for miles. I told myself I had prepared for this, brought enough food, water, and blankets. I had even packed extra batteries for my flashlight and a first aid kit. Still, a flicker of unease crept into my chest. Every creak of the cabin, every scratch of a branch against the exterior walls, felt amplified. I went to bed early, trying to ignore the noises. Sleep came fitfully. Around midnight, I woke to a faint sound outside, footsteps on the soft ground, slow and deliberate. My heart rate spiked. I told myself it was probably an animal. Bears could wander near cabins sometimes, and raccoons, deer, even stray dogs. But the steps didn't sound like an animal. They were too deliberate, too heavy. I lay still, straining my ears, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had begun. I told myself it was nothing, but the rest of the night was spent half awake, listening to every whisper of wind, every crack of wood. Morning came reluctantly. The sun broke through the trees, casting long golden rays across the clearing. I made coffee and tried to shake the uneasy feeling. Outside, I surveyed the area more carefully in daylight. Nothing seemed out of place. No tracks, no signs of other humans nearby. I reassured myself that last night had been paranoia, fueled by isolation and darkness. The next day, I decided to hike a nearby trail I had noticed on the map. It started a few hundred meters from the cabin, winding through dense forest, with occasional clearings revealing small streams. The trail was overgrown, and I had to push branches aside and step over roots, but it was manageable. I spent hours walking, taking in the sunlight filtering through the canopy, listening to birds and the distant rush of water. The isolation felt less threatening in daylight, even pleasant. Returning to the cabin, however, I noticed subtle changes. The firewood I had stacked neatly outside had shifted slightly. Small footprints in the soft dirt around the porch didn't match any of my own. They were human, small, careful. I froze, my heart thumping. Perhaps someone had been walking near the cabin while I was gone. But why leave no sign of approach? The thought of someone watching, lurking, made my stomach knot. I checked all the doors and windows, locked, secure. Nothing else seemed disturbed. That night, the sounds returned. This time, there was scratching at the door, faint at first, then growing louder. My stomach tightened into knots. I kept the lights on, flashlight ready, and moved cautiously around the cabin, checking every corner. Nothing was visible outside, though I caught glimpses of movement through the trees, shadows shifting too smoothly for animals. My anxiety escalated, but I reminded myself to stay rational. Whoever it was could be another hiker, a local exploring, maybe even lost. Sleep became impossible. I stayed awake all night, sitting near the stove, listening, watching. Every sudden noise, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, even the wind, set my nerves on edge. I could hear the faintest sounds from the forest. A footstep here, a low groan of a branch bending there. Occasionally, it sounded like someone breathing just beyond the reach of the cabin's light. By the third day, I realized I needed to leave, but the isolation had made it worse. The dirt road was nearly hidden by fallen leaves and undergrowth. My car, left where I had parked, seemed impossibly far away. I packed quickly, throwing essentials into my bag, and prepared to hike back along the narrow road. Every sound along the way made me jump. A twig snapping, a bird taking flight, a branch scraping against bark. I kept moving, faster than I intended, heart pounding in my chest, adrenaline making every step feel heavier. About halfway back to the car, I saw something that froze me. Footprints, fresh, human, moving parallel to the road. They were deliberate, as if someone had been following me, keeping just far enough to be unseen but close enough to track my movements. Panic surged. I ran the rest of the way, adrenaline blinding me to fatigue. The car was in sight, and I dove inside, locking the doors immediately. I started the engine and drove without slowing until the trees thinned and I reached the main road. Back in town, the quiet threat of the forest stayed with me. I called the local authorities to report the footprints and the strange activity. They came out, investigated the cabin, but found no one. The cabin itself was undisturbed aside from my hastily packed bag and the shifted firewood. The officers suggested it could have been a local hiker or someone else exploring the woods. No signs of forced entry, no real evidence of a threat. But I knew the truth in my gut. Someone had been there, watching, patient, waiting. I never returned to that cabin. The forest, once inviting and silent, became a place I could not bear to revisit. But the experience left me with a heightened awareness of the fragility of solitude, the thin line between peaceful isolation and vulnerability. Even now, years later, I remember the way the shadows moved through the trees, how every small sound could have been a threat, and the sheer weight of being utterly alone with someone unseen. It taught me respect for the wilderness, and for the fact that sometimes danger doesn't announce itself. It simply waits. I had been planning this trip for months. The idea was simple. A few days alone in a remote cabin in the woods to get away from the constant noise of the city, to clear my head, and to be completely disconnected from everything. I didn't need fancy amenities or a crowded tourist spot. I wanted isolation and I wanted quiet. I found the cabin listed online through a small, barely known rental service. The pictures showed a simple wooden structure, not more than 1 story high, with a small porch that overlooked a dense line of trees. There was no electricity except for a single generator, and water came from a nearby well. It sounded perfect. I drove for hours, taking increasingly smaller roads until eventually, I was navigating narrow gravel paths that seemed to be overgrown on the sides. The trees formed a tunnel over the road, blocking out most of the daylight, and the air smelled damp and earthy. I remember thinking, as I wound through the path, that this was far enough from everything. The sense of seclusion was immediate, almost jarring. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low, a dull orange slipping behind the tall pines. The cabin itself was modest but sturdy. The wood was dark and weathered, but it looked solid, not at all the rickety type you might expect in a remote area. There was a small porch with a chair that had seen better days, a table with peeling paint, and a stack of firewood neatly piled to the side. I parked my car on a small patch of flattened earth and got out, taking a deep breath of the forest air. There was a quiet hum from the woods, the kind you only notice when there are no cars, no planes, no people, just the wind moving through the trees. I had packed lightly, just the essentials. Food for a few days, water, a first aid kit, a few books, and a small lantern with extra fuel. I set my bag down on the floor inside the cabin and started to take in my surroundings. The interior was small, maybe 3 rooms at most. A living space with a simple couch, a small table, and a wood stove. A tiny kitchen area with basic utensils and a sink, though the water from the well needed filtering before drinking. A small bedroom with a bed that looked slightly too narrow for comfort but serviceable. The windows didn't have screens, just wooden shutters, and the only door was a simple latch. I spent the first hour settling in, unpacking, and making a small fire in the stove. The cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and old pine. The air was slightly musty, the kind of smell you notice when a place has been empty for weeks. As the light outside dimmed, I closed the shutters and lit the lantern. The glow was soft but enough to see every corner of the cabin. The first night passed quietly, though it wasn't without unease. I had slept with the door slightly cracked, just in case I needed to leave quickly, though I wasn't sure what I would leave from. The wind blew through the trees, making a constant rustling sound. Occasionally, I thought I heard something else. Footsteps perhaps, or the snap of a small branch. But when I looked, there was nothing. I tried to dismiss it as imagination. After all, the woods were alive with small creatures, and in the quiet, every sound seems louder. The next morning, I went for a walk. I wanted to get my bearings, see the area around the cabin, and explore a bit. The forest was dense, with thick underbrush that made walking slow. The sun filtered through the trees in long streaks, illuminating patches of moss on the ground. I noticed signs of wildlife, tracks, droppings, a few small nests, but nothing threatening. Birds flitted from tree to tree, and occasionally, I caught a glimpse of a squirrel or rabbit. Despite the beauty, there was a constant edge of tension I couldn't shake. Being alone in a forest this thick left you vulnerable, and that realization pressed against me the entire time I was outside. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The firewood I had stacked outside had been disturbed. Not drastically, but enough that it looked like someone or something had moved a few pieces. I froze, scanning the area. The trees were still, the birds had gone quiet, and there was no sound of anyone approaching. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. Still, a small part of me felt that uneasy prickle of awareness. Over the next day, I tried to stay busy. I cleaned the cabin, stacked the firewood neatly, and walked a little farther than before. As the day wore on, the sense of being watched grew stronger. I would pause mid-step and feel that weight on my shoulders, the sensation that someone or something was just beyond the line of sight. I couldn't see anyone, couldn't hear anyone, but the feeling was persistent. That night was worse. I had made a proper fire in the stove and sat near it with my back to the wall, trying to feel safe. The wind outside was stronger, and it pushed against the cabin with a loud, uneven howl. Then I heard it, a sound like soft scraping, coming from the side of the cabin. I froze. It was deliberate, slow, deliberate, like someone was testing the boundaries, running their hands or an object along the outside wall. I grabbed a heavy flashlight and slowly moved to the door, peeking through the small crack in the shutter. Nothing. The forest was black, almost absolute, with only the moonlight filtering through the trees. But the noise continued intermittently, fading, then returning. My heart was pounding, and my hands were shaking as I gripped the flashlight. I decided not to investigate outside, not yet. I couldn't see anything, and there was no way to defend myself effectively out there. I spent hours sitting in the corner, listening to the sounds of the forest and the occasional scrape outside. The minutes stretched endlessly, and I realized that time had a way of bending when you are alone, scared, and in the dark. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I dozed fitfully, the flashlight still in hand. Morning brought light and a sense of temporary relief. I went outside carefully, scanning the perimeter. There were tracks, small and inconclusive, around the cabin, but nothing that gave a clear identity. I began to consider the possibility that someone had been near the cabin without my noticing. Maybe a hiker, maybe someone passing through. But the isolation here made that unlikely. The nearest trailhead was miles away. My unease deepened. I decided to take action. I gathered some long branches from the surrounding area, sharpened a few with my pocket knife, and prepared a small defensive perimeter around the cabin. It was crude, but it gave me a sense of control. I also found a few large rocks and placed them near the windows where I thought someone could approach. Every sound, every movement in the forest, now made me tense. I tried to sleep that night near the center of the cabin, the fire burning low, listening to the occasional scrape or rustle outside. Days passed in a tense rhythm. I ventured out less, stuck closer to the cabin, and fortified my awareness. The woods were beautiful in a strange way, serene and untouched, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not entirely alone. Each sound, each shadow, each small animal crossing my path seemed magnified. I realized that fear, when unbroken by human contact, can twist reality slightly. A branch falling could sound like footsteps. A bird taking flight could seem like someone approaching. It wasn't until the fourth night that I realized what had been happening. I woke abruptly to the sound of a door latch being fiddled with. My blood ran cold. I grabbed the heaviest rock near me and moved silently toward the door. The latch moved again. Someone was definitely trying to get in. I whispered to myself that I had to stay calm, had to stay smart. I grabbed a second rock and waited, listening. The sound stopped. Long minutes passed. I didn't dare move or breathe too loudly. Eventually, the sound of retreat came. Someone had left. I didn't know who, I didn't know why, and I didn't know how long they had been watching. That day, I made a decision. I packed quickly but carefully, leaving the cabin as I had found it, except for the traces of my own fear and defensive preparations. I didn't take time to explore further, didn't linger. I drove back the way I had come, keeping my eyes on the forest edges, expecting shadows or movement. By the time I reached the main road, daylight was falling, and the sense of danger began to fade slightly. I realized I had been lucky. There was no violence, no direct confrontation, just the unnerving knowledge that someone had been observing me in a place I thought was private. The relief was immense, but the memory lingered. The sound of the latch, the rustle outside, the feeling of unseen eyes. Back in the city, I couldn't shake the experience entirely. I told myself that the cabin was just wood, the forest just trees, and people, for whatever reason, sometimes intrude into the lives of others. But I also knew that my vigilance, my preparations, and my careful observation had prevented a worse outcome. The experience taught me a strange combination of fear and respect, for nature, for isolation, and for the unknown ways humans can encroach upon your space. I never returned to that cabin, but I kept the memory clearly, a vivid reminder that solitude can be beautiful but also dangerous, that quiet can mask threat. I had been looking forward to the weekend for weeks. The city felt suffocating with its constant noise, endless traffic, and the feeling that everyone around me was always in a rush. I decided to rent a cabin deep in the mountains, somewhere isolated, away from people, where I could just be alone and think. The cabin was advertised as remote but accessible, which I thought was perfect. I packed my car with food, water, blankets, a small first aid kit, and my hiking gear. I had no intention of doing serious hiking, just some short walks in the area around the cabin. I wanted peace, quiet, and solitude. The drive up the winding mountain road was longer than I expected. The sun was starting to set by the time I reached the last turn before the cabin. The road was narrow, lined with dense forest on both sides. The trees were thick, their trunks dark and heavy with shadow, and the smell of damp earth filled the air. I remember thinking how easy it would be to get lost if I went off the road. My phone signal was patchy, cutting in and out, and that made me a little uneasy, but I convinced myself that it was fine. I had a paper map and the cabin address written down. The cabin itself was small but sturdy, made of dark wood with a sloped roof and a small porch. It sat in a clearing, surrounded by tall pines and firs. The setting sun made the cabin look almost like it belonged in a painting, but the shadows stretching across the clearing made me feel a creeping tension. I parked the car next to the cabin and stepped out, taking a deep breath of the cold mountain air. It was refreshing, crisp, and clean. I unlocked the cabin and stepped inside. The interior smelled faintly of old wood and dust. It was simple, with a small kitchen area, a living space with a wood-burning stove, and one bedroom. There was enough firewood stacked near the stove to last a few days. I felt a mix of excitement and relief. I was finally away from the city, from noise, from people. I unpacked my things and made a small fire in the stove. The warmth spread slowly through the cabin, filling the corners with a soft glow. I ate a simple dinner, something I had brought from home, and then spent the evening reading by the fire. Outside, darkness fell, and the forest became a wall of blackness. I could hear the wind moving through the trees, the occasional snap of a branch, and the distant sound of some animal moving through the underbrush. I told myself that it was normal, part of the wilderness experience, but my stomach had a small knot of unease. I brushed it off and went to bed early, ready for a long, quiet night. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized it was a noise closer, sharper, deliberate. It was a knocking sound, soft but distinct, coming from outside. My heart started to beat faster. I told myself it was probably just an animal, a deer or a raccoon, maybe a bear moving past the cabin. I tried to convince myself of that, but the knocking continued at irregular intervals, too intentional to be a branch swaying in the wind. I lay in bed, listening, my mind racing. Then the knocking stopped and I tried to relax, but sleep didn't come easily after that. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. Every rustle of leaves sounded like someone moving outside. The next morning, I went outside to check the perimeter. There were no obvious signs of anything unusual, no footprints besides mine leading from the car to the cabin. The snow from the previous week had partially melted and refrozen, leaving a slick layer on the ground. I tried to dismiss the incident as nerves, telling myself the isolation was playing tricks on me. I spent the day exploring the small area around the cabin, walking along a narrow trail that led to a stream. The forest was quiet in the daylight, but I noticed that many of the trees had markings, scratches that looked almost like claws but were too high up for any animal I knew. I photographed them with my phone, though the signal was weak, and tried not to think about what could have made them. That night, the knocking started again, this time louder and more insistent. I stayed by the window watching, but I saw nothing. No movement, no shadow, just the trees swaying in the wind. My rational mind tried to explain it. Branches falling, animals, but the sound felt too deliberate. I decided to sleep lightly, keeping a small flashlight and a kitchen knife on the bedside table, feeling the strange tension in my chest tighten as the hours passed. On the third day, a storm began. The wind picked up, and snow started falling heavily, covering the ground in a thick, white layer. The road back down the mountain would be dangerous, maybe impossible. My phone was almost completely dead, and the weak signal I had before was gone. I realized that I was essentially trapped. I couldn't leave until the storm passed, and I wasn't sure how long that would take. The cabin, which had felt cozy, now felt isolating and claustrophobic. I rationed my food and water carefully, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy. I spent hours shoveling snow around the cabin to keep the entrance clear, stacking more firewood near the stove, and checking that the windows and doors were secure. Every creak of the wood, every thump of the wind made me jump. That evening, the knocking returned, but now it was accompanied by footsteps crunching in the snow. I froze, listening. The snow was falling so heavily that it was difficult to see outside, but I could hear the rhythm of footsteps moving around the cabin. My mind raced. Was it a lost hiker? Someone trying to rob the cabin? My pulse was rapid, and I felt a cold sweat on my back. I stayed low, moving slowly toward the back of the cabin to avoid being seen, keeping the knife in my hand. The footsteps stopped abruptly, then retreated. I spent the rest of the night awake, listening, my nerves on edge. The next morning, the storm had intensified. Snow piled high around the cabin, and I realized I would be trapped here for at least a couple of days. I cleared a small path to the road, but it quickly filled in with new snow. Around midday, I decided to venture outside carefully to inspect the surroundings. As I stepped out, I noticed fresh footprints in the snow, leading toward the back of the cabin. They weren't mine. They were larger, heavier, human. My heart pounded, and I immediately retreated inside, barricading the door as best I could with a chair. I checked every window. All seemed secure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching, waiting. I stayed by the stove, keeping the fire going, the knife ready. Hours passed slowly. The storm howled outside, and the isolation pressed in on me. I rationed my food further, drank only small amounts of water, and tried to keep my mind occupied by cleaning, organizing, and maintaining the cabin. Every noise outside made me flinch. By the fourth day, the storm had subsided slightly. I knew I needed to leave before nightfall, or I might be trapped even longer. I grabbed my supplies, bundled up in layers, and started down the road. The snow was deep, and the cold was biting. I trudged slowly, careful not to slip on the ice-covered road. My mind kept returning to the cabin, to the footprints, to the knocking. The feeling of being watched hadn't left me, even as I moved away. After about an hour, I saw the first sign of a tire track in the snow. Another human, coming or going. Relief mixed with fear. I wasn't alone in this wilderness, but I didn't know if this person was a threat. Eventually, after several hours of walking, I reached a main road and flagged down a passing vehicle. The driver was kind, gave me a ride to the nearest town, and I contacted the authorities. I returned to the cabin a few days later with police assistance. They found no one inside. The footprints around the cabin had disappeared, washed away by fresh snow. There were no signs of a break-in, but the scratch marks on the trees remained. I never learned exactly who had been near the cabin during the storm, whether it was a lost hiker or someone with ill intentions. But I learned something important about myself. My instincts were sharp, and I could survive in situations where danger wasn't immediately visible. I also realized the importance of preparation and vigilance when venturing into remote areas. In the weeks afterward, I reflected on the experience repeatedly. I prepared better for future trips, brought more reliable communication tools, and learned how quickly isolation could magnify fear. I never returned to that particular cabin, but I often remembered the stillness of the forest, the way the snow muffled every sound, and the sense of being watched even when no one was visible. It changed the way I approached solitude and wilderness. I became more careful, more aware, and more respectful of the unknown elements in nature and human behavior. The memory of those nights remained with me, not as a ghost story, but as a clear, real lesson about vulnerability, caution, and the strength required to remain calm under pressure. I had been looking forward to a quiet weekend away in the cabin for months, imagining the relief of leaving behind the endless noise and stress of the city. The cabin was remote, tucked deep into a forest far from any real roads, accessible only by a narrow dirt track that twisted through the trees and hills. The directions I had gotten were vague, the sort that assume you know exactly what the old logging road past the fallen oak, second turn to the right means. I left early in the morning, before the sun had fully climbed above the horizon, driving a little hatchback that had seen better days. The engine whined constantly, and the suspension groaned over uneven stretches, but it got me there. The air changed noticeably the moment I started winding through the forest. The sharp tang of wet leaves and pine hit my nose first, and then the sounds of the city, cars, sirens, people, faded completely, replaced by the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Birds called somewhere overhead, but their songs were distant, almost shy, as if they were aware of intruders. I passed old stumps and collapsed tree trunks that looked like they had been there for decades, overgrown with moss so thick it seemed to suck the color out of everything around it. The road was narrow, muddy in parts, and slick from recent rains. My car slid slightly as I took a turn too fast, and I had to correct with a careful hand on the wheel. I remember thinking then that I hadn't seen another car for at least half an hour. When I finally arrived, the cabin was exactly like the pictures, though photos never quite capture how isolated a place feels until you are actually there. It was a small wooden structure, rough-hewn logs stacked to make walls, a metal roof that had rusted orange in parts, and a single stone chimney that suggested a fireplace inside. There was no electricity, no phone signal, and only a small well nearby for water. The first thing I did was park the car on the uneven patch of dirt that served as a driveway. The ground sloped slightly, causing the car to tilt, and when I opened the door, I realized the air smelled of wet wood and something else, earthy, almost decaying. It wasn't unpleasant, just unfamiliar, like the forest had its own secret breath. I unloaded my things slowly, being careful not to drop anything. The cabin didn't have much inside. A few chairs, a table with scratches and burns from past visitors, a small wood stove, a mattress on a wooden frame, and shelves that still held a few dusty canned goods left by whoever had been there before. There was a pile of firewood stacked against one wall, damp from the rain, and I spent some time arranging it, checking for rot, making sure I could get a fire going later. The cabin was dark inside despite the morning light, the small windows filtering only a green-tinted glow through the trees outside. Shadows clung to the corners of the rooms, and I felt a small shiver run down my spine, even though I told myself it was just the chill of the forest air. I set up my sleeping area on the mattress, laid out my backpack, and checked the supplies I had brought. Canned food, bottled water, a flashlight, matches, and a first aid kit. I wanted to feel prepared. Out here, it wasn't the idea of ghosts or monsters that worried me. It was the reality of being alone with no help nearby if something went wrong. The forest was full of unpredictable things. Wild animals, treacherous terrain, and the way the weather could change in an instant. That thought lingered as I opened the window to let in some fresh air, listening to the quiet swish of leaves in the wind. The first night was unnerving but manageable. I built a fire in the stove, the smell of burning pine filling the room. I ate a simple dinner of canned beans heated in a pot, washed down with water. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the roof and making branches scrape against the walls. I lay on the mattress and listened to it, feeling the isolation settle around me like a heavy blanket. Every small sound made me jump. A branch snapping somewhere far off, a distant hoot of an owl, the soft scratching of some small creature against the outer wall. Sleep came slowly. It was the second day when things started to feel genuinely uneasy. I had planned to hike around the surrounding woods, to take in the sights and maybe find a stream or pond the maps had mentioned. I left the cabin mid-morning, carrying only a small day pack with water and some food. The forest was dense. Trees pressed closely on either side of the narrow trail. Their roots tangled across the path, and underfoot the soil was soft and spongy with damp leaves. As I walked, I noticed signs of wildlife. Claw marks on tree trunks, tracks in the mud, tufts of fur snagged on branches. Most were small, harmless animals, but the size of some of the prints hinted at something larger, perhaps a deer or a bear. I tried not to let it bother me, telling myself I was being careful and that the chances of encountering a dangerous animal were slim. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky, filtered by the thick canopy, creating shifting patches of light that made the forest seem alive, even when nothing was moving. I had walked farther than I realized when I decided to turn back. That's when I noticed the first real sign that something was off. The trail I had come in on, the familiar muddy path marked with occasional broken branches, had no marks of recent human passage beyond my own. At first, that seemed normal. It was a remote area, but then I saw it. Footprints, human footprints, fresh, not much larger than mine, following closely behind the track I had made. They weren't deep, but they were distinct, and the spacing suggested someone had been walking briskly. My stomach tightened. I quickened my pace, telling myself it was probably another hiker, someone who had left earlier, maybe not expecting anyone else to be on the trail. Still, my heart beat faster as I glanced over my shoulder. The prints didn't change. They continued exactly in line with mine. I tried to stay calm, keeping my eyes on the path and pushing through the dense underbrush. The forest seemed to grow quieter. Birds stopped singing, and the occasional rustle of small animals disappeared. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the wet leaves. I reached the point where the trail split, and I decided to take a side path that led back toward the cabin from a different angle, hoping to throw off whoever or whatever was following. I walked faster, trying not to make a sound, feeling the oppressive silence press in around me. That's when I saw something else. Broken branches, snapped at odd angles, as if something large had been moving through the woods nearby, moving around me, keeping pace without being seen. I felt my pulse spike and my hands start to sweat. By the time I saw the cabin's roof through the trees, I was moving almost in a run. The dirt track, slick from earlier rains, made my footing precarious. I stumbled over roots, skidded on mud, and cursed under my breath, desperate to get back. The cabin never looked so welcome in my life. But then I froze. A figure was standing at the edge of the clearing, just at the tree line, watching me. I couldn't make out much, tall, dark, unmoving, but the presence was undeniable. I stopped completely, trying to catch my breath and think. The figure didn't move as I raised my hands and stepped slowly forward. As my eyes adjusted to the shade, the figure disappeared. I had no idea if it had moved into the woods or if it had been a trick of shadows. I didn't wait to find out. I sprinted the last stretch, slipping on mud, hands scraping against the rough wooden walls, and threw myself into the cabin. I locked the door behind me, bolted it with the sliding latch, and checked the windows. Nothing. Silence. I could hear my own heavy breathing, the thump of my heart in my ears. I piled furniture in front of the door, grabbed my flashlight, and started methodically checking every corner of the cabin. Nothing. No one. But the feeling remained. Someone had been near, watching, moving in ways I couldn't track. I realized then that isolation wasn't just loneliness. It was vulnerability. If someone wanted to hurt me here, the forest would hide them, and no one would hear me. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the stove, keeping a fire burning, listening to every creak, every small sound, eyes darting to the windows. The wind rattled the roof, and the branches scraped the walls, and I jumped at each noise. I rationed my water and food carefully, telling myself I needed to survive until morning. I thought about calling for help, but there was no signal, and shouting would do nothing but give away my location. I stayed awake, moving slowly around the cabin, making mental notes of exits, potential hiding spots, and places where I could defend myself if necessary. I imagined someone trying to break in, and my body tensed. I thought about the stories of people disappearing in the woods, of attacks that never made it to the news. Fear was thick in the cabin, heavy, almost physical, but I had no choice but to endure it. By the morning, exhaustion had taken over. My eyes were red, my back ached from sitting in tense positions, but I felt a measure of relief. The forest seemed calmer in daylight, less menacing. I decided to leave immediately, even though I hadn't prepared for such a quick departure. I gathered my I had been looking forward to this trip for months. The idea of escaping into the woods, away from the city noise, the traffic, and the constant chatter, was exactly what I needed. I had rented a small cabin, isolated and rustic, deep in the northern forests, far from any real town. It was advertised as being completely off the grid, which was one of the main reasons I chose it. I imagined long walks among the trees, nights spent reading by the fire, and mornings with nothing but the sound of birds and wind to greet me. I packed my bag carefully, making sure I had enough food, water, and supplies for a week. I also brought extra batteries, a first aid kit, a flashlight, a hatchet, and a small camping stove. I didn't want to take any chances. Even though I had stayed in cabins before, this one felt more remote, and the thought of being completely alone made me feel a strange mixture of excitement and anxiety. The drive to the cabin was long. The last 30 miles were on a dirt road that twisted and turned through dense forest. Trees pressed close on either side, so that sunlight barely touched the ground. Occasionally, I saw the tracks of animals, deer or maybe bears, but nothing else. The deeper I went, the quieter it became, until the hum of the engine was the only sound. I noticed my chest tightening slightly as the shadows of the trees grew longer with the late afternoon sun. I told myself I was being silly, that this was exactly why I wanted to be here. Solitude, the kind that comes with no human interference, is supposed to be peaceful. But something about the way the road narrowed, the way the trees leaned overhead, made it hard not to feel watched. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was dipping toward the horizon, painting the sky in reds and oranges. The cabin itself was small, wooden, and a bit weathered, but sturdy. A thin layer of moss had formed on the roof, and the windows were slightly fogged from condensation inside. There was a small porch with a rickety railing, and a woodpile stacked carefully to one side. I parked the car near the cabin, grabbed my bag, and walked up the steps. The door opened with a creak. The inside smelled faintly of wood smoke and must, a combination I found comforting. It was simple. One main room with a small kitchenette, a table, and a fireplace, plus a separate bedroom with a bed, dresser, and small nightstand. The floorboards creaked with every step, and I realized that even the slightest noise could echo through the empty space. I unpacked quickly, wanting to get settled before it got too dark. I stacked firewood near the fireplace, filled the water jugs, and set up my flashlight where I could easily reach it. I also checked that the stove worked, testing a burner and making sure I had a good supply of propane. I noticed a small trail outside the back door, a narrow path leading into the forest. I assumed it was meant for short walks or for accessing a nearby creek. I made a mental note to explore it the next day, but for now I wanted to relax. I started a small fire in the fireplace, the flames crackling and popping, filling the room with warmth and a sense of comfort. Night came quickly. The sun disappeared behind the dense trees, and the cabin was plunged into darkness except for the glow of the fire. The silence outside was absolute. At first, it was soothing, but after a while, it started to feel oppressive. Every small sound seemed amplified. The crack of a branch outside, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the wind. I tried to read, but my eyes kept drifting to the windows, scanning the darkness for movement. I told myself it was just my imagination. There was no one here. I was alone, and that was exactly what I wanted. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Around midnight, I was woken by a noise. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, like someone walking on dry leaves. I froze, listening. The sound came from outside, near the back of the cabin. I held my breath, straining to hear. It stopped after a few moments. My first thought was a deer or maybe a raccoon. I tried to convince myself of that as I got up and looked out the window. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the small clearing near the cabin, but nothing was there. I checked the locks on the doors, which were old but functional, and reassured myself that the cabin was secure. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Every small sound made me tense, my body alert to every possible threat. The next morning, I decided to explore the trail behind the cabin. I put on a jacket, took my hatchet and flashlight, and stepped into the forest. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. The trail was narrow, overgrown in parts, with roots and rocks making footing tricky. I walked slowly, listening to the forest. Birds called in the distance, and I saw a few small animals darting between the trees. After about half an hour, I reached a small creek, its water clear and cold. I followed it upstream for a while, fascinated by the sound of running water and the occasional fish darting through the shallows. I marked the path carefully in my mind so I could return easily. After exploring for about an hour, I headed back to the cabin, feeling more comfortable in my surroundings, more familiar with the landscape. The second night was harder. The previous night's sounds had left me uneasy, and I found myself constantly checking the windows, listening to the wind rustle through the trees. Around 11 p.m., I heard it again. This time it was different, a faint scraping noise, like something being dragged across the ground. I froze, my heart racing. I grabbed the hatchet I had left near the bed and crept to the window, shining the flashlight outside. The clearing was empty, except for the shadows of trees moving with the wind. The sound stopped, but the tension lingered. I double-checked the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. I told myself to calm down, that it was probably an animal, maybe a deer caught in the underbrush. But deep down, I knew the sound had a different rhythm, something deliberate, something that didn't belong to the forest. The following day, I found evidence that unsettled me further. While gathering firewood, I noticed footprints in the mud near the cabin. They weren't deer prints or any other animal I recognized. They were human, and they led from the tree line to the back of the cabin and then back again. They were fresh, not more than a few hours old. My stomach tightened. I had locked everything, and I hadn't heard anyone approaching. I followed the prints carefully, noting that they didn't continue beyond the clearing. Whoever it was had come close but not entered. I cleaned up the footprints as best I could, trying to erase the evidence, but the thought that someone had been near my cabin without my knowledge stayed with me. I spent the rest of the day on edge, constantly checking the perimeter and making small noise traps with sticks and rocks to alert me if anyone approached again. Night fell once more, and the fear intensified. Every small noise set my nerves on edge. Around 1 a.m., I heard it again, scraping, this time accompanied by a soft thud, like a branch being dropped or kicked. I grabbed the flashlight and hatchet, my hands shaking slightly. I scanned the clearing outside, my eyes struggling to adjust to the darkness. Nothing moved. I sat by the window for hours, listening. I noticed movement at the edge of the clearing, just a shadow, fleeting. I couldn't tell if it was a person or an animal. I stayed awake the rest of the night, every nerve taut, fire burning low, flashlight in hand. Sleep was impossible. The next morning, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I needed to know who or what was out there. I packed a small bag with essentials: water, food, flashlight, and my hatchet. I left the cabin door unlocked but kept the keys in my pocket. I started walking the perimeter of the property, careful to stay quiet but alert. I saw signs of movement, footprints leading from the tree line, broken branches, flattened grass. It was deliberate, systematic. Whoever it was had been circling the cabin, studying it. The realization made my stomach churn. I returned to the cabin briefly to retrieve my phone. Service was spotty, but I managed to get one bar and called the local ranger station. I explained my situation as best I could, though I didn't want to admit my fear aloud. They told me to stay inside, lock all doors and windows, and wait for help. It would take them a few hours to reach me because of the remote location. I barricaded the cabin the best I could. I stacked firewood against the doors, moved furniture to block windows, and set up noise traps outside. I stayed near the fireplace, flashlight ready, listening to the forest. Every sound made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to move closer. Hours passed slowly. Around mid-afternoon, I heard the approach of a vehicle, wheels crunching on the dirt road. Relief flooded through me. A ranger truck appeared, and I ran to the door waving my arms. They got out, checked the cabin, the surrounding forest, and confirmed the footprints. They reassured me that I was safe now, that whoever had been out there was gone. They stayed until nightfall. I had been planning the trip for months, marking every detail in my notebook, calculating the supplies I would need, and trying to anticipate everything that could go wrong. I had rented a small cabin deep in the mountains, far from the nearest town, far from cell service, and far from anyone who could help me if things went sideways. I wanted solitude, a break from the constant noise and clutter of the city, a chance to be alone with myself and the natural world. I told myself I was prepared, but I would soon discover that preparation was no match for reality. The drive up to the cabin was long and winding. The road was narrow, unpaved in sections, with loose gravel and rocks scattered across it. I drove slowly, gripping the steering wheel tightly, knowing that a single misstep could send me sliding down the steep embankment on the side of the road. The trees towered over me, dense and dark, blocking much of the afternoon sun, and a mist began to rise as I climbed higher, creating an eerie, almost suffocating atmosphere. I felt a small thrill in the tension, a sense that I was moving away from the ordinary world into something far more raw and primal. When I finally saw the cabin, it was smaller than I had expected. It sat at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by thick forest on three sides, and a narrow creek ran just beyond the clearing. The wooden structure looked sturdy but weathered, with patches of moss growing on the roof and sides. A thin trail of smoke rose from the chimney, evidence that the previous tenants had left recently. I parked my car on a small dirt pad and stepped out, stretching my legs and breathing in the cold, crisp mountain air. It smelled of pine, damp earth, and smoke. It was clean, pure, and yet there was something oppressive about it, as if the forest itself was watching, silent and still. The cabin's interior was simple. There was a small living area with a wood stove, a modest kitchen with a sink that seemed to work only on gravity-fed water from a tank, a bathroom with a composting toilet, and a bedroom with a small bed. Everything was functional, if a bit worn, and I immediately felt a strange sense of isolation. There was no electricity beyond the few solar panels on the roof, no running water beyond what I could collect from the creek. I had intended this, wanted it, but as I unpacked my supplies, canned food, bottled water, a first aid kit, a small gas stove, I felt a small twinge of doubt. Alone, with nothing but the forest around me, I realized that even the simplest mishap could become a major problem. I spent the first day exploring the surrounding area, marking the paths, inspecting the creek, and noting potential hazards like steep drops and areas where the ground seemed unstable. I collected firewood, stacked it neatly near the cabin, and inspected the stove. I had left the cabin just before dark, carrying my flashlight, but by the time I returned, the sun was low and shadows stretched across the clearing like dark fingers. The forest seemed louder at that hour, every branch snapping in the distance, every rustle in the undergrowth felt magnified. I told myself it was just animals, the wind, the ordinary sounds of nature, but a knot of unease settled in my stomach. Night came quickly, faster than I expected. With no city lights, the darkness was absolute. I lit a small lantern, sat by the stove, and tried to make sense of the unsettling feeling that had grown in me during the day. I ate a simple dinner and went to bed early, hoping that sleep would erase the creeping tension. I had set my phone to airplane mode to avoid distractions, but I also knew that if something went wrong, I would have no way to call for help. That thought made it harder to sleep, but eventually, exhaustion pulled me under. The first night passed without incident, though I woke several times to strange noises. The creak of the cabin settling, a branch falling in the forest, a distant animal cry. I reminded myself that none of it was unusual and that fear could easily grow out of nothing when one was alone in the dark. The next morning, I resolved to explore further, to understand the terrain better, and to gather more firewood. The sun rose behind a layer of mist, painting the forest in muted grays and greens. I spent hours walking along the creek, examining the water, the rocks, and the fallen trees. At some point, I realized that I had wandered further than I intended. The forest was denser than it had seemed, with thick undergrowth and hidden dips in the ground. I retraced my steps carefully, marking the trees with small ribbons so I could find my way back if I got lost again. Over the next few days, I settled into a routine. I collected water, chopped firewood, cooked meals on my small stove, and explored the forest during the daylight hours. Yet, despite the rhythm of these tasks, the isolation began to gnaw at me. The forest felt alive in ways I could not control. I would glance into the shadows and feel certain I had seen movement that wasn't there. At night, every sound was magnified. The rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, the distant call of an animal I could not identify. I began to understand that being alone in a place like this required constant vigilance. There was no one to help if I fell, if I got lost, if I were injured. I was entirely dependent on my own judgment. The sense of unease grew one afternoon when I noticed something unusual near the creek. There were footprints in the soft mud, human footprints, leading from the edge of the forest down to the water. They were fresh, the impressions deep, as if the person who made them was heavy or carried a load. I felt a surge of panic, my pulse quickening. Who could be in these woods? The area was supposed to be remote, and I had seen no one since arriving. My first thought was that it could be a hunter, but the prints were strange, bare feet, small, with no sign of shoes. I examined them carefully, trying to convince myself that I was imagining it, but the evidence was undeniable. For the next several days, I became hyper-aware. I checked the perimeter of the clearing frequently, watching for signs of anyone approaching. I reinforced the cabin doors and windows as best as I could, even though I knew the structure offered little real protection. Every noise in the forest set my nerves on edge. One evening, as I was stacking firewood, I heard a distant rustling and the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching the clearing. I froze, listening, my heart hammering. The sound stopped abruptly, as if whoever it was realized I was aware. I remained still for what felt like an eternity, holding my breath, but eventually, silence returned. I went inside, locked the door, and sat by the stove, staring into the small circle of light. I could not see outside, but I imagined the forest waiting, silent and patient, filled with something I could not name but felt intensely. Sleep became difficult after that. I found myself waking at odd hours, heart racing, listening for noises. The forest seemed different at night, oppressive and heavy, like a living entity that was aware of my presence. I began to ration my food and water more carefully, preparing for the possibility that I might be stuck for longer than I had anticipated. Every day, I walked the perimeter of the clearing, checking for new footprints or signs of intrusion. Sometimes, I thought I saw movement just beyond the trees, shadows shifting in the moonlight, but when I looked closer, there was nothing there. My mind began to play tricks on me. I knew that fear could be as dangerous as any predator in the woods, and yet it was impossible to ignore the sense that I was being watched. The tension reached a breaking point on the fifth night. A storm had rolled in, fierce winds and heavy rain lashing the cabin, and I was trapped inside with nowhere to go. The power of the wind made the cabin shake, and the rain pounded on the roof and walls, drowning out other sounds. But amid the storm, I heard something else. scratching at the door, low and deliberate. My first thought was an animal, but the pattern was too methodical, too controlled. Someone or something was outside. I grabbed my flashlight and my only weapon, a heavy metal wrench, and crept to the door. Peering through the small window, all I could see were shadows, branches bending in the wind, and the rain-soaked clearing. The scratching stopped as soon as I moved, and the night returned to silence, broken only by the storm. I stayed awake until dawn, sitting by the stove, exhausted and tense, every sense straining for another sign. When morning finally arrived, the storm had passed. The forest was drenched, the creek swollen with rainwater, and the air smelled clean and sharp. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the perimeter. There were no signs of anyone having been near the cabin during the storm, no footprints in the mud, nothing. My relief was immense but tempered by lingering doubt. I knew I could not stay on edge indefinitely. I needed a plan, a way to regain some sense of control. I decided to leave. I had enough supplies for one last day, and I would pack what I could into my car and make the slow drive down the mountain. The forest felt oppressive in a way that day, shadows deeper, the air heavier. I moved quickly, collecting my belongings and checking the I had been planning this trip for months, thinking it would be a peaceful retreat away from the noise of the city, away from the endless obligations and the constant pressure of work. The cabin I found was small, rustic, and isolated, tucked deep in the forest near a remote lake. From the photos online, it looked perfect. Wooden walls, a stone fireplace, a small dock stretching into the water. I had imagined mornings with mist rising from the lake, evenings watching the sun set through the trees, nights falling silent except for the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of leaves in the wind. I convinced myself it would be restorative. It was far enough that my phone had no service, but I didn't mind. I wanted to disconnect. The drive to the cabin was long. I left early in the morning, the sky just lightening with the first hints of dawn. The highway turned into narrow roads, winding through hills that were heavily forested. Eventually, the pavement ended, and I followed a dirt road that had deep ruts from previous rains, the tires of my car sliding slightly on the loose soil. I passed one small house along the way, its windows dark, its yard overgrown, and felt a faint unease that I tried to shake off. Maybe it was just the isolation, I told myself. Soon enough, there was nothing but trees on both sides, dense enough that the sun barely touched the road. When I finally saw the cabin, I was relieved. It was exactly as it had appeared in the photos. A simple structure of weathered wood, surrounded by pine and birch trees, with the lake glinting in the sunlight behind it. I parked and got out, taking a deep breath of the crisp forest air. The silence was immediate and complete, broken only by the distant sound of water lapping against the shore and the occasional chirp of a bird. I carried my bags inside and began exploring. The cabin had one main room, a small kitchen, a bathroom with an old but working shower, and a loft that could serve as a bedroom. Everything was clean, though slightly dusty from disuse. After unpacking, I decided to take a walk along the lakeshore. The path was narrow and lined with roots and rocks, but it led me to a small clearing where the water was calm and clear. I sat on a fallen log for a while, watching the sunlight glitter off the lake, feeling the tension of the city start to dissolve. I noticed tracks in the mud near the edge, deer probably, or maybe raccoons. There was a sense of being truly alone, but it felt peaceful, almost exhilarating. That night, I made a fire in the stone fireplace. The wood crackled and smelled of smoke and pine. I cooked a simple meal on a portable stove and ate slowly, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. The wind picked up, rattling the cabin's windows, and I felt a small shiver of anxiety. But I reminded myself that it was just wind, just the sounds of a forest at night. I set my alarm early and climbed into the loft bed, falling asleep to the gentle rustle of leaves. The next day, I woke to gray clouds and the smell of damp earth. I had planned to hike a nearby trail that promised views of the surrounding hills. I packed water, some snacks, a flashlight, and a small first aid kit, and headed out. The trail was narrow and steep in places, roots snaking across the path. The forest was denser than I expected. Sunlight barely broke through the canopy. I was alone, truly alone, and for a while it was freeing. I moved carefully, mindful of each step, aware that a twisted ankle or a wrong turn could be serious here. Hours passed. The trail became less defined, more overgrown. I realized I had lost track of the markers, the little orange ribbons tied to trees that hikers often use to stay on track. My heart rate quickened slightly. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself I had a map and compass, but as I looked around, nothing seemed familiar. The trees were all the same, the ground covered with leaves and pine needles that muffled my own footsteps. The clouds above had darkened further, and I noticed a light drizzle starting. I turned to head back, but something felt off. The trail I had taken didn't look the same as I remembered. I retraced my steps slowly, scanning for the ribbons, but they were gone. Or maybe I had missed them. Anxiety started to creep in. The forest had shifted somehow. Even the sound of the rain on the leaves felt different. My chest tightened as I realized I might be truly lost. I checked my compass. North was in the direction I expected, but the terrain looked unfamiliar, the slope steeper, the underbrush thicker. Every step seemed to take me further from safety rather than closer. I found a relatively flat area and decided to stop and rest. I drank some water, tried to calm my racing thoughts. I forced myself to think logically. I had a flashlight, my backpack, the clothes I wore. I could find shelter, I told myself. The drizzle turned into heavier rain, soaking me quickly. I tried to keep my footing on the slippery ground. I realized that if I didn't find the trail soon, I might have to spend the night in the forest. I remembered the cabin and focused on that thought. I estimated the direction based on the lake's position from the trailhead. I moved slowly, carefully, avoiding hidden roots and loose stones. Hours seemed to pass. The rain made everything darker, the forest more oppressive. I thought about my options. Keep moving or find a makeshift shelter and wait for daylight. I chose to keep moving, hoping that if I stayed active, I could make it back. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. I was exhausted, wet, and hungry. My flashlight was still working, but the batteries would not last long. I tried to make mental notes of landmarks, but in the darkness, everything seemed to blur together. I stumbled over roots and rocks, scraping my hands and legs, and my anxiety turned into a more visceral fear. I was no longer just lost. I was in danger of hypothermia if I didn't find shelter soon. Then, I saw a faint glow through the trees. My heart leapt. I ran toward it, slipping and falling several times. The glow resolved into the faint outline of the cabin, lights flickering from the fireplace. Relief washed over me like a wave, almost overwhelming. I pushed myself through the last stretch of mud and leaves, falling into the doorway of the cabin, shivering, soaked, and exhausted. I collapsed on the wooden floor for a moment, listening to the sound of the rain pounding on the roof. I built a fire immediately, stacking damp wood as best as I could, blowing gently to ignite the smoke. Heat gradually returned to my frozen limbs. I changed into dry clothes I had in my backpack, ate some snacks, and sat by the fire, reflecting on how close I had come to a real disaster. The forest had seemed like a maze, indifferent and threatening, but the cabin, my small refuge, had remained. I realized how fragile the boundary between safety and danger could be in the wilderness. I spent the night awake, occasionally checking the windows, listening to the rain and wind. Sleep was fitful, but I managed a few hours. In the morning, the storm had passed, leaving the forest glistening and fresh. I went outside to survey the area, recognizing paths I had ignored the day before. Using the sun, the lake, and landmarks I now remembered, I planned a careful, deliberate hike back to the main road. I spent the next day retracing my steps, moving slowly, marking trees as I went, and double-checking the direction constantly. By mid-afternoon, I reached the dirt road. Relief washed over me, mingled with a sense of triumph. I had survived the forest, survived my own panic, and learned the importance of preparation, focus, and respect for the environment. Back at the cabin that evening, I cleaned my scratches and bruises, organized my gear, and made a proper fire. I ate a more substantial meal, savoring the warmth and security. The lake reflected the sunset in hues of pink and gold. I realized I had been scared, truly scared, but I had also discovered resilience in myself I didn't know existed. I understood that fear wasn't just about monsters or myths. It was about real, tangible danger, the kind that comes from isolation, from nature, and from your own mistakes. I spent the remainder of the week at the cabin more cautiously. I avoided wandering too far, I made careful notes of trails, and I always carried extra supplies. I observed the wildlife, noted changes in the weather, and maintained constant awareness of my surroundings. Each day, I felt more competent, more in control, though the memory of that night in the forest lingered, a quiet reminder of vulnerability. When it came time to leave, I packed carefully, making sure I left the cabin in good condition. I walked along the lake one last time, taking in the beauty, the calm, the quiet strength of the forest. The memory of fear was still there, but it had been tempered with understanding, with respect, and with accomplishment. The drive back to civilization was quiet. I reflected on how easily things could have gone wrong, how quickly comfort could turn to danger, and how essential it was to remain vigilant and prepared. By the time I returned to my apartment in the city, I felt different. I had been planning this cabin trip for months. The idea of escaping into the forest, away from phones, emails, and the endless demands of city life, was all I could think about during the weeks leading up to it. The cabin itself was small and isolated, nestled deep within the woods near the edge of a narrow, winding river. It wasn't advertised online in any way except for a single local listing, and the owner had insisted I take the old dirt road leading from the highway rather than the GPS, saying it was faster, even though the directions sounded strange. I ignored the warning as a quirk of a local, not something to take seriously. The drive there was longer than I expected, and the road became narrower with every mile. Trees pressed close on either side, branches scraping against the car when the wind picked up. I remember glancing in the rearview mirror and noticing how quickly the last hints of civilization disappeared. There were no houses, no fences, no streetlights, just the dense forest stretching endlessly, shadows deepening under the sun. A few times, I almost missed the turn indicated in the directions because the markings were faded and the dirt road twisted unpredictably. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked exactly like the photos. Rustic, built from dark logs, with a steep pitched roof and a small stone chimney. It sat in a clearing surrounded by tall pine trees, and the river ran just beyond the line of trees. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles, a scent both calming and slightly oppressive. I parked the car and stepped out, feeling a strange mix of exhilaration and unease. The quiet hit me first, the kind of quiet that makes your own heartbeat seem loud. There were no birds singing, no rustling of small animals. Even the wind felt dampened, as if it hesitated among the trees. I unloaded my gear, carrying a small backpack and a bag of firewood. The cabin looked empty but well-kept. Dust in corners suggested it wasn't used often, but the floors were swept, and the fireplace was ready. The windows were thick glass, slightly fogged from the inside. I checked the locks and, to my relief, everything seemed secure. There was electricity and a small gas stove, though the owner warned me the connection was unreliable. I set down my bag, ran a hand along the rough wood walls, and breathed in the smell of aged pine. The isolation felt intoxicating at first, but as the sun sank lower in the sky, a creeping tension began to settle over me. I spent the afternoon exploring the immediate surroundings. The riverbank was uneven and rocky, the current moving swiftly over submerged stones. Small fish darted in the shallows, and the occasional bird, sparse though they were, flitted between branches. I collected a few dry twigs for kindling, noticing that the forest seemed unnaturally still. No squirrels, no distant deer calls, no wind brushing leaves above. It was as if everything had paused, waiting for something. The sun went down faster than I expected, leaving the forest bathed in dim twilight. Shadows stretched long and unnatural, merging with the shapes of trees until I had trouble distinguishing depth. I started the fire in the fireplace, the flames casting flickering light over the cabin's interior. The warmth was comforting, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Not in a supernatural sense. There was no presence, but that primal awareness you feel when you are truly alone, and every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves makes your senses spike. Night in the forest is a different kind of darkness than the city. Without streetlights, every shadow is absolute. The cabin's small windows framed black rectangles that seemed to move, the trees like black silhouettes shifting in the wind. Around 10 o'clock, I went outside to relieve myself, flashlight in hand. The river sounded louder at night, a constant rushing murmur, but the forest beyond it was silent, unnervingly so. I caught movement, a slight disturbance of the branches, a shadow darting between trees, and froze. A deer, maybe, or some other creature, but the silhouette was quick and deliberate. I didn't hear it run. It vanished. Back inside, I double-checked the locks and drew the curtains. I lay in the small bed upstairs, listening to the river, the occasional gust rattling the eaves, and the soft creaks of the cabin settling. Every sound made me startle. Every shadow seemed to twist into something approaching human form in my mind. I told myself it was nothing, that I was alone, and yet the feeling lingered. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of the front door opening. The cabin had a slight draft. I had thought it might have been the wind, but the hinges didn't creak like that. My stomach dropped. I sat up, heart pounding, listening. Footsteps followed, deliberate, slow, heavy. Not a deer, not a small animal. Human. My mind raced. I had brought a small camping knife in my bag. Nothing more, and no cell signal for miles. Panic clawed at my chest. I quietly slipped out of bed and moved to the top of the stairs. The main room was dark except for the firelight fading into embers. The door at the bottom was open just slightly, moving with the faintest groan on its hinges. I could see a shadow moving near the edge of the porch, then stepping inside. Whoever it was, they were careful, deliberate, looking around, searching. I ducked behind the banister, trying to stay out of sight. My first instinct was to run, but the front door was the same door the intruder had just passed through. If I made a dash for it, I'd be seen. The second option was to lock myself in the bedroom, but the intruder might hear me moving upstairs. I decided to wait, heart hammering in my ears. The shadow moved slowly across the room, reaching toward the fireplace. It crouched slightly, running a hand along the mantel. A small metal object glinted in the dim light. Crowbar. They were prepared. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours. The intruder rifled through cupboards and drawers, checking for valuables or anything worth taking. Every step they took sent vibrations through the floorboards. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself of the knife in my bag, the fact that they couldn't see me yet, and the hope that they would eventually leave with nothing. The intruder grabbed the small safe by the wall. I had put in some cash and a few personal items, nothing more. They tried to open it, shaking it violently. Then a loud cracking sound echoed. The hinge of the safe broke. My stomach sank. I realized I had to act. Staying hidden meant risking discovery if they turned toward the stairs. I could see the river through the window. It was pitch black, but the drop-off wasn't too far. Maybe I could escape that way. I crept silently toward the back door, making as little noise as possible, each floorboard groaning slightly. The intruder didn't hear, but I couldn't risk miscalculating. I reached the door, opened it slowly, and slipped outside into the darkness. The forest embraced me immediately. I ran without thinking, stumbling over roots and rocks, branches slapping my face, the river to my right making a constant rushing noise to guide me. The intruder hadn't noticed yet. I thought I heard footsteps behind me, heavy, deliberate, but I didn't dare look back. Adrenaline carried me forward. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs shook, then plunged into the river. The water was icy, pulling at me, but it masked my scent and muffled my movement. I swam downstream, keeping low, dragging myself over rocks and under fallen branches. By dawn, I had moved far enough downstream to reach a dirt track. Exhausted, soaked, and shivering, I walked until I saw the faint outline of a farmhouse in the distance. I knocked on the door, soaked to the bone, trembling, and the farmer called the authorities. They came, traced my route back, and found the intruder attempting to flee the property. Turns out he had been using a series of dirt roads and abandoned cabins in the area to hide from previous theft investigations. My cabin had just been his next target. Everything I had feared had been real, but through careful patience, quick thinking, and a bit of luck, I survived without injury. In the aftermath, I stayed with the farmer while the police investigated. I returned home eventually, but the memory of the forest, the suffocating quiet, and the intruder's slow, deliberate movements stayed with me for months. I never went back to that area, and I learned an important lesson about isolation and preparation. I upgraded my locks, installed a security system, and always kept my phone fully charged, even in remote areas. The fear I felt that night never fully left me, but it also reminded me how careful attention and calm action can save a life when the situation becomes real and dangerous. I had been planning the trip for months, ever since I first discovered the old cabin online. It was tucked deep in a national forest, miles from the nearest road, the kind of place you had to earn your way to, which is exactly what I wanted. My life had been a blur of work, obligations, and constant noise, and I needed silence, the kind of absolute quiet you can only find where no one can reach you. I pictured mornings with mist curling around the trees outside my window, the smell of damp earth, and nights where the stars would be so bright I could almost touch them. I packed carefully, taking everything I thought I might need for a week: food, water, extra clothes, first aid, and tools. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, partly because I wanted to feel completely alone, partly because the cabin's location was so remote. No one I knew would understand why I was going so far out into the forest. The drive was long, longer than I had expected. GPS could only take me to a dirt road that wound endlessly through the trees, narrowing until it barely held one car. Every mile, the air seemed cleaner, the sky higher, the sun breaking through the canopy in long streaks. I passed abandoned logging sites, piles of discarded machinery rusting into the soil, and streams that crossed the road in sudden, shallow gashes. Each time I stopped to take pictures or just breathe, I felt a strange, uneasy thrill. This was no tourist area. This was raw land, untamed and indifferent to my presence. By the time I arrived at the cabin, the sun was low, almost dipping behind the dense line of pines. The cabin itself was smaller than it had seemed in the photos, built of heavy logs, dark and weathered. The windows were grimy, the roof sagging slightly in one corner, and the porch creaked with every step. There was no phone signal. That alone hit me with a jolt of reality. Here, there was no easy escape, no instant contact with the outside world. I parked the car nearby, unpacked slowly, and studied the cabin. The door opened without resistance, the hinges squealing, and inside it smelled of dust, damp wood, and something I couldn't immediately name. I unpacked, checked the windows, the locks, the fireplace, everything twice. The more I inspected, the more I realized just how isolated I was. The first night was calm, almost peaceful. I lit the fireplace, cooked a small dinner over it, and watched the flames flicker. Outside, the wind moved the branches, rattling the cabin's walls. There were sounds, of course, birds, squirrels, the occasional distant crack of a falling branch, but nothing threatening. I slept fitfully, waking several times to the noises of the forest, but nothing seemed unusual. It was the second night that changed everything. I had spent the day exploring a trail that followed a small creek, stepping carefully over fallen logs and muddy banks. By the time I returned, the sky was overcast, the air damp and heavy. I noticed the first hint that something was wrong before I even entered the cabin. A scrap of paper, maybe torn from a notebook, lying on the porch. It had no writing, just a faint smudge of dirt, as though someone had been there and left in a hurry. I told myself it was probably from the wind, that animals or forest debris had blown it there, and I pushed the thought away. Inside, nothing appeared disturbed. I locked the door and tried to focus on dinner, chopping vegetables and starting the fire, but the unease lingered. Around midnight, I woke to a sound I couldn't place. It was soft, almost inaudible at first, a scraping sound, like someone dragging their shoe across wood. I froze, straining my ears. The sound repeated, closer now, moving around the cabin. I told myself it was a tree branch against the side, the wind carrying it in an odd way. But when I turned on the flashlight and shone it across the room, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. Footprints. Small, muddy footprints on the wooden floor, leading from the door toward the center of the room. They weren't mine. I hadn't seen any animals big enough to make such tracks inside, and nothing outside could have left them without breaking the door or windows. I didn't know how long they had been there, but their presence told me someone or something had been inside while I was out. I checked the locks again. Everything was still secure. The windows hadn't been opened. I felt the panic start to rise, a pressure in my chest, my breath quickening. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every sound, the wind against the walls, the settling of the roof, the rustle of leaves outside, made me flinch. I stayed awake, sitting near the fireplace with a hatchet I had brought for chopping wood, just in case. I didn't know if I was being paranoid, but the footprints had been real, and I couldn't ignore that. The next morning, I scoured the perimeter. No footprints outside, no signs of forced entry. Everything looked normal. I tried to convince myself it had been a one-time thing, maybe a wandering hiker or someone using the cabin before me. I resolved to stay alert but continue with my plan. I spent the day chopping firewood, filling the water supply and stocking food. I made sure every tool, knife, and hatchet was within reach. I also kept a small emergency whistle in my pocket, just in case. The forest was beautiful, serene even, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time a shadow moved among the trees, my heart jumped. By the third night, the sounds returned. Not just scraping, but now faint knocks on the walls, almost deliberate. I couldn't see anyone, but my senses were on high alert. I sat up all night, the fire dwindling in the fireplace, my hands clenching the hatchet. The noises didn't stop until dawn, when they simply vanished. I was exhausted, but too nervous to sleep properly. The following day, I made a plan. I reinforced the door with a heavy log, blocked the windows as best I could, and set up makeshift alarms using tin cans and string around the cabin's perimeter. If anyone tried to approach, I would know. I also moved all my essential items close to me: water, food, flashlight, hatchet. The forest outside, which had seemed welcoming and peaceful at first, now felt like it was closing in, every shadow a potential threat. Night fell again, darker than before, clouds blocking the moon. I sat near the fireplace, listening. The first sound came around 11, footsteps on the porch. I froze, holding my breath, gripping the hatchet. The footsteps circled the cabin slowly, deliberate, and then stopped. I waited, every nerve straining. Then a low scraping at the door. My pulse raced. I stayed perfectly still, listening, waiting for anything else. Hours passed. Eventually, the sounds stopped, leaving only silence and my own ragged breathing. I didn't sleep again that night. Morning came gray and cold. I checked the perimeter again. This time, I found signs of recent activity. Footprints in the mud leading around the cabin, disturbed underbrush, broken twigs. Someone had been there overnight. My fear sharpened into a clear realization. I was not alone, and this wasn't a random trespass. Someone had been stalking the cabin, waiting, watching. I packed quickly, stripping the cabin of anything of value, taking only essentials, and left the cabin locked as best I could. I drove as fast as the rough road allowed, my hands white on the wheel, scanning the forest constantly. I didn't see anyone follow me, and eventually, after miles of twisting dirt roads, I reached a main road and the first gas station in hours. I called the police and reported the situation, giving them the location of the cabin, the footprints, and everything I had noticed. They took the report seriously and promised to send a ranger or patrol to investigate. I stayed nearby in a motel for a night, sleeping in a room with locks on every door, listening for any sounds outside. I felt unsafe, but I also felt relief that I had taken action and that I was no longer isolated. A few days later, I received a call from the ranger. They had investigated the cabin. There were signs someone had been living nearby, moving through the forest, observing the cabin without entering. They hadn't caught anyone, but they confirmed that the footprints and signs I had noticed were consistent with a trespasser who had spent nights hidden in the trees. They advised me never to return alone and recommended staying in areas with people around. The relief was immense. I hadn't imagined the events, but I had survived them, escaped, and taken the right precautions to protect myself. The experience stayed with me for a long time, a reminder that the forest, no matter how beautiful, can hide dangers that aren't supernatural or fantastical. They are real. People can be real threats, and nature itself, while calm and still, can become menacing when combined with human malice. I never returned to that cabin. I sold the equipment I had brought, avoided remote trips, and learned to respect the combination of wilderness and isolation. The fear faded slowly, replaced with caution and awareness, but I never forgot the quiet dread of that night, the weight of unseen eyes, and the footprints that proved I was not alone. I had been planning this solo cabin trip for months. My job had been suffocating me with deadlines, endless emails, and the constant pressure to perform. I needed a break from everything, a real escape, somewhere I could be alone, away from people, phones, and noise. I found a cabin online, secluded in the woods of northern Vermont, far from any main road, nestled beside a narrow, sluggish river. The pictures made it look idyllic. A wooden structure with a stone chimney, surrounded by tall pines and thick underbrush, with a small dock extending into the river. It seemed perfect. I booked it immediately, promising myself that I would spend the week hiking, reading, and doing absolutely nothing. The drive there was long. By the time I left the last highway and turned onto the winding dirt road that led to the cabin, it was already late afternoon. The trees closed in around the narrow path, their branches scraping against my car as if trying to warn me to turn back. I laughed at myself, realizing how silly it sounded in my head, but I felt a small shiver anyway. My GPS had trouble finding the exact location once I was off the main road, so I relied on the directions the cabin owner had emailed me. Turn left at the fallen oak, then go straight until you see the clearing with the large rock. The cabin is just past that, by the river. I had passed the fallen oak, then the clearing, then the rock, and finally saw it. The cabin sat in a slight depression, almost hidden from view by a wall of firs. I parked and stepped out, stretching my stiff legs. The air smelled like damp pine and moss, and the river murmured quietly, the only sound besides the occasional bird. It felt peaceful, almost too peaceful, the kind of quiet that made you hyper-aware of every small noise. I carried my backpack inside and set it down near the door. The cabin smelled faintly of wood polish and old smoke, a lingering reminder of someone else's presence, though it wasn't unpleasant. I spent the first hour walking through the cabin, inspecting everything. The kitchen was small but functional, with a gas stove, a sink, and a few cupboards stocked with basic cookware. There was a fireplace in the living area, a few shelves of books, and a small stack of firewood next to it. The bedroom had a simple bed with clean sheets and a thick quilt. The bathroom was tiny, but clean, with a shower and a sink. Everything seemed in order. I unpacked some clothes, grabbed my journal, and made myself a simple meal of canned beans and bread. By the time I was done eating, the sun was dipping behind the trees, and the cabin began to grow dim. I lit a few lanterns I had brought along and settled into the chair by the window, looking out over the river. The sound of flowing water was soothing, hypnotic almost. I thought about going to bed early, but I couldn't resist a short walk along the riverbank. I put on my jacket and stepped outside. The cold air hit my face sharply, and the ground was damp beneath my boots. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, dark and dense, the trees forming walls that felt both protective and oppressive. As I walked, I noticed something odd. The riverbank, which I had assumed would be empty, seemed to have footprints. Not mine and not animal prints. They were deep, almost human, though not perfectly clear. My heart started to beat faster. I crouched down and examined them. They were large and they trailed off into the trees on either side of the river. A rational part of me told myself it might have been previous visitors, or maybe even a hunter, though I hadn't seen any signs of hunting. Still, unease settled in my chest. I walked back to the cabin, keeping a careful eye on the shadows among the trees, trying not to let my imagination run wild. That night, the forest sounded alive in ways I had never noticed before. The wind moved through the trees with a hollow rustle, and somewhere in the distance, an animal called out with a sharp, urgent cry. Every small sound made me startle. I kept the lanterns lit, though the glow didn't reach far beyond the walls of the cabin. When I finally went to bed, I double-checked the locks and closed the blinds. I lay awake for hours listening. Every creak of the wood, every brush of wind against the walls made my pulse quicken. The next morning, I forced myself to follow my plan. I would hike along the river and explore the area. I packed water, some snacks, my camera, and a small knife, more for reassurance than necessity, and left the cabin. The forest in the daylight was beautiful. Sunlight spilled through the gaps in the trees, making patches of the forest floor glow gold. Birds sang, insects buzzed. I walked for hours, following narrow animal trails and occasionally climbing small rises to get a better view. Despite the beauty, a subtle tension never left me. Every rustle, every shadow seemed to make the forest feel slightly too alive, too aware of me. By midday, I returned to the cabin to rest. As I approached, I noticed something I hadn't before. The door was slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. I had locked it before leaving. I froze for a moment, trying to rationalize it. Maybe the wind had blown it open, but the cabin was sheltered from any strong breeze. My heart was pounding. I stepped forward slowly, gripping the knife in my pocket, and pushed the door open fully. The inside was exactly as I had left it. Nothing seemed moved or disturbed, no signs of anyone having entered. My relief was immediate, but so was my awareness that someone or something had been close enough to test the door. I spent the rest of the day keeping a careful watch. I set up a system of simple traps near the entrance, not to catch anyone, but to alert me if someone tried to come in. I blocked the windows slightly with furniture and placed small noisemakers like tin cans that would clatter if moved. Every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves now had me turning my head quickly, scanning the forest. Night fell slowly, and I prepared myself for the worst. I ate sparingly, kept my lanterns lit, and waited. Hours passed with no disturbance, though the tension never left me. Around midnight, I heard it, a deliberate, slow crunching of leaves outside the cabin. My heart jumped violently. I froze, gripping the knife tightly, straining to hear. The steps circled the cabin, slow, careful. Whoever it was, they knew what they were doing. My mind raced through options. Leave through the back? Barricade myself further? Stay and wait for daylight? Every choice seemed fraught. The footsteps stopped for a long moment, then started again, moving along the side where I had my traps. A tin can fell with a loud clang. My heart leaped into my throat. I realized then that hiding in the cabin wouldn't be enough. I needed to get help, but I had no cell signal, and the nearest house was miles away. I couldn't risk running into them in the dark. I needed a plan. I grabbed my flashlight, my knife, and my backpack, which I had packed with essentials, and opened the back door silently. The footsteps were closer now. I moved into the shadows, sticking close to the trees, making my way down the riverbank. My goal was a higher rise I had seen during the day where I could get a clear view and perhaps see someone in the distance or a road. I crept through the underbrush, keeping my breathing low. Every step was careful, measured. I reached the ridge after what felt like an eternity and looked down. In the faint glow of my flashlight, I saw the faint silhouette of someone standing by the cabin, barely moving. I stayed crouched, trying not to make a sound. They didn't seem to be armed, but I couldn't be sure. I waited until they finally left, slipping into the shadows of the forest. Only then did I start moving again, slowly and cautiously, until I found a faint trail that led further away from the cabin. I followed it for what felt like hours. The forest seemed endless, and panic gnawed at me. Finally, just as the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I stumbled upon a dirt road. My heart leaped. I ran toward it, waving my hands until a car appeared in the distance. I flagged it down, breathless, shaking. The driver, a local, called the sheriff for me. They returned to the cabin with me that morning. When they investigated, they found nothing, no footprints beyond the ones I had seen, no signs of anyone hiding. The sheriff explained that sometimes people explore abandoned or secluded cabins illegally, or it might have been someone scouting for a theft. I didn't return to that cabin after that week. I cut the trip short, exhausted, anxious, and unnerved. But the experience taught me something valuable. Even in the quiet, beautiful wilderness, human presence is unpredictable, and you must respect it. I didn't encounter anyone physically harming me, but the fear, the awareness that someone could be watching, the complete vulnerability of being alone in the forest was real, and it stayed with me for years. I learned to trust my instincts more, to never underestimate the quiet, and to be prepared, always. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. My life had become a cycle of work, sleep, and the occasional grocery run, and I needed a break, something that would get me out of the city, away from the constant hum of traffic, the endless emails, the endless responsibilities that felt like weights I could never shake. I had found a cabin for rent on a small lake up in the mountains, about a 3-hour drive from my apartment. It was advertised as quiet, remote, and secluded, and the pictures showed a small wooden cabin with a porch, surrounded by trees, the lake reflecting the sky in a perfect mirror. It seemed ideal. I booked it immediately, excited to spend 3 days alone, just me, the forest, and the lake. The drive there was long but beautiful. The roads narrowed as I left the highway, winding through dense forests and steep hills. The air changed too, becoming cooler, fresher, smelling of pine and wet earth. By the time I reached the last turn, a dirt road hidden behind a cluster of trees, I was already tense with anticipation. The GPS had lost signal miles back, and the map on my phone was only vaguely helpful, but that was part of the experience I wanted. I wanted to feel far away from everything, disconnected, like I was the only person in the world. The cabin was exactly as I had seen in the pictures, maybe even more real and raw than the photos could capture. It was small, built of logs, with a simple pitched roof and a porch that looked out onto the lake. The windows were dark, reflecting the forest behind me, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke, like someone had built a fire here recently. I parked the car beside the cabin and got out, stretching, feeling the cool mountain air on my face. Inside, the cabin was modest. There was a small living area with a wood-burning stove, a table with 2 chairs, a kitchen corner with a tiny sink and a gas stove, and a single bedroom in the back with a small bed. The floor creaked slightly under my weight, and the windows were a little grimy, streaked with dust and watermarks from rain, but overall it was clean. I unpacked my bag, setting out a few essentials: food, water, a lantern, matches, a blanket, and a notebook. I wanted to spend the weekend reading, writing, and just being completely alone, disconnected. As the day slipped into evening, the light outside dimmed. Shadows stretched across the cabin floor as the sun sank behind the mountains. I built a small fire in the stove, feeling its warmth spread through the room. Outside, the forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so. I was alone here and I knew it. No neighbors, no cars, no sounds of life except the wind in the trees and the distant murmur of water from the lake. At first, it was peaceful, exactly what I had wanted. But as the shadows grew longer and the night deepened, there was a subtle shift. The quiet became oppressive. Every small noise, the cracking of wood, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a branch, sounded louder, sharper, closer. My imagination began to fill in the gaps. I tried to focus on practical things. I checked the doors and windows, making sure they were locked and secure. I examined the small shed outside, where the cabin owner had left a stack of firewood. It was simple, utilitarian, nothing sinister, but my eyes kept drifting back to the forest, watching the dark shapes move between the trees. I told myself it was just the wind, that animals were probably nearby. Deer, maybe a raccoon, birds sleeping in the trees. But the feeling of being watched was persistent. I went to bed earlier than usual that night, hoping that sleep would chase away the tension. The bed was firm, the blankets warm, but every time I closed my eyes, I could hear sounds outside. A rustle, a step on gravel, a branch snapping. My mind tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just the forest being alive, but the rational part of me was weak against the rising panic. I finally fell asleep somewhere after midnight, only to wake a few hours later to a sound that stopped my heart. It was subtle at first, a faint dragging noise coming from outside. It sounded like something heavy being pulled across the dirt, slow and deliberate. My first instinct was disbelief. The forest? But no, the sound was too rhythmic, too measured to be natural. I sat up, straining my ears, heart thumping in my chest. The sound stopped, then a louder crack, like a tree branch breaking, echoed through the forest. I held my breath, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. Maybe an animal, a bear, a large deer, a falling branch. I told myself over and over that the chances of anything malicious were low. Then came the footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate, moving from the edge of the clearing toward the cabin. I could hear them on the dirt, on the gravel, moving closer, circling the cabin. Panic surged. I wanted to grab my phone, but there was no signal. I wanted to run to the car, but the keys were inside the cabin. I realized I had no immediate way to call for help. I sat in the shadows of the room, trying to control my breathing. The fire had died down, leaving only embers that cast a faint red glow. I could hear the footsteps stop outside one of the windows. Something moved past the window slowly, cautiously. My heart was in my throat. I told myself to stay calm, to make rational decisions. I moved quietly to the kitchen, grabbed a heavy cast iron skillet, and held it in my hands. It was small, but it felt like a weapon, a way to defend myself. The sound outside grew closer, then paused. I could hear breathing, low and uneven, but it was hard to tell if it was animal or human. I realized then that no bear or deer would approach like this, stalking the cabin, moving deliberately. My mind raced, trying to imagine who could be out there. It was late, far from the nearest road, and the nearest town was miles away. I had no idea if this was a hunter, a trespasser, or someone with worse intentions. Hours passed. I stayed crouched by the wall, watching the darkened windows, gripping the skillet until my knuckles ached. The footsteps receded and returned several times, circling the cabin, always stopping just out of reach. I could hear other noises too. Faint voices far in the distance, too muffled to understand. The low creak of the trees swaying in the wind. I felt trapped, completely isolated, vulnerable in a way I had never experienced. Dawn came slowly. The first light spilled into the cabin, casting pale shadows across the floor. I was exhausted, physically and mentally. The sounds had stopped sometime during the night, leaving only the quiet forest and the occasional chirping of birds. I dared to step outside. The clearing was empty, untouched except for faint footprints in the dirt around the cabin, large, irregular, too big for a deer, too uneven for a human walking normally. Someone had been there, moving around the cabin all night. I felt sick, realizing how close they had come to actually breaking in. I knew I couldn't stay. The nearest ranger station was nearly an hour's hike, but I had to reach it. I packed quickly, gathering everything I had brought in a panicked blur. I left the cabin door open, stepping cautiously into the clearing. The air was cold, the forest still and watchful. I moved toward the path I had arrived on, trying to memorize landmarks so I wouldn't get lost. The hike back was grueling. My legs shook from exhaustion. My eyes scanned constantly for any sign that someone was following me. Every snapping branch made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hide a figure. I told myself to stay rational. that the footprints could have been from hunters or campers who had passed the previous day. But the memory of the sounds, the dragging, the slow circling footsteps, refused to leave me. I didn't stop until the first sign of the main road appeared. Once I reached the ranger station, I was met with questions and disbelief. The rangers took my statement seriously, noting the footprints and the description of the cabin. They told me they had reports of suspicious activity in the area recently. Trespassers, possibly people looking for isolated cabins to target. They offered to escort me back to my car and stay nearby while I packed it. I felt a mix of relief and residual fear, knowing I had survived, but also knowing how close I had come to a potentially deadly encounter. Driving away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a figure among the trees. The city lights eventually reappeared on the horizon, and I felt my body finally release some of the tension that had gripped me for nearly 24 hours. I realized, in the end, that the solitude I had sought had been real, but so had the danger. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't something I could ignore or pretend didn't exist. It was human, tangible, and very close. When I returned home, I dismantled my weekend plans entirely. I no longer sought remote isolation. I researched safety protocols for staying in remote cabins, learned to check surroundings thoroughly, to carry alarms, to avoid going completely alone. I didn't stop going to the mountains, but I never went anywhere without a plan. I never thought a weekend trip to a remote cabin would turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. I had been driving for hours along winding forest roads, the kind that seem endless and suddenly disappear into nothingness, until finally, I arrived at the small, weathered cabin I had rented. It sat tucked deep in the woods, surrounded by tall pine trees that blocked most of the sunlight, casting long shadows even in the middle of the day. The air smelled sharp and earthy, with the faint scent of pine needles and wet soil. I parked my car on a rough patch of ground, the gravel crunching beneath the tires, and I took a moment to look at the cabin. It was old, made of darkened logs that had weathered countless storms. The roof had a few patches where the shingles were missing, and the windows were slightly grimy, making it impossible to see inside clearly. I felt a flicker of unease, but I brushed it aside, telling myself that the isolation was exactly what I wanted. A chance to get away from the city and the noise and just be alone with nature for a few days. I carried my backpack up the short path to the cabin, noticing how the forest around me felt alive and suffocating at the same time. The wind rustled through the trees, creating a low, constant hum, and I could hear birds moving in the branches, though the deeper I went into the forest, the quieter it became. I opened the door to the cabin, and the smell of damp would hit me immediately. Inside, the cabin was sparse but functional. There was a small kitchen area with a stove that looked old but usable, a fridge that hummed quietly, and a tiny table with 2 chairs. The main room had a wood-burning stove, a few shelves with old books, and a worn sofa with a blanket draped over it. There was a single bedroom at the back with a narrow bed, a small dresser, and a window that faced the forest. I set my bag down, took a deep breath, and began to unpack, trying to shake the strange feeling that I wasn't alone. By evening, the forest outside had gone completely dark, and the cabin felt smaller and more confining than it had during the day. I had lit a few candles and started a fire in the stove, trying to create some warmth and light. The wind had picked up outside, causing the trees to creak and groan, and I could hear branches scraping against the cabin walls. Every sound made me jump, my imagination running wild despite my best efforts to stay rational. I ate a simple dinner of canned soup and bread, trying to focus on mundane things, but the quiet was oppressive. Even the occasional howl of a distant animal seemed amplified in the darkness, echoing through the trees in a way that made me tense up. I tried to sleep, but the cabin felt different at night, almost as if it was holding its breath around me. The wooden floors creaked as the wind shifted, and every small noise sounded suspiciously close, as if someone or something was moving around just outside the walls. I kept telling myself it was just the wind, just the forest settling, just my imagination. I checked the locks on the doors and windows several times, tracing my fingers along the cold metal, making sure they were secure. I didn't expect anyone to be out here, not in the middle of nowhere, but there was a part of my mind that refused to quiet down. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the dark and trying to force myself to sleep. But my eyes kept darting toward the window, half expecting to see a figure standing there. Around midnight, I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound at first, like something dragging across the ground. I froze, straining my ears, and the sound came again, closer this time. My heart started to race. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and quietly slipped out of bed, trying not to make a sound. The cabin floor was cold under my bare feet, and every creak seemed unnaturally loud in the dark. I moved toward the front door, peeking out the window. The forest was pitch black, but I thought I saw a shadow move between the trees. I told myself it was just the branches swaying in the wind, but the sound I had heard didn't come from the trees. It came from the ground, from somewhere near the cabin. I went to the door and slowly turned the lock, heart pounding, and stepped outside, flashlight in hand. The cold air hit me sharply, and the beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness. I scanned the area around the cabin, the gravel path, the underbrush, the towering pines, but there was nothing there. No animal tracks, no footprints, nothing that could explain the sound I had heard. I stood there for a long time, listening, and eventually convinced myself it must have been an animal brushing against something or debris falling in the wind. I went back inside, trying to calm myself, and double-checked that all doors and windows were locked. For the next few hours, sleep was impossible. Every little sound, the groaning of the cabin, the rustling outside, the occasional snap of a branch, made me jump. I kept thinking about what I would do if someone had followed me out here, someone who knew where I was. I considered calling for help, but the phone signal was weak, almost non-existent. I realized I was entirely alone, completely cut off from the world, and the weight of that fact pressed down on me. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn, sitting by the fire with the flashlight on the table, ready to defend myself if I had to. When morning finally came, the forest looked peaceful again, with sunlight filtering through the trees and birds singing. I went outside to inspect the area around the cabin, looking for any sign of what might have caused the noises. That's when I noticed something. A small, shallow hole dug near the back door, and the earth around it was disturbed. My stomach sank. It wasn't a large hole, not big enough for a person to hide in, but it was evidence that someone or something had been there. I felt a surge of fear, but I also realized I had to stay calm and think clearly. Panicking would only make things worse. I spent the day reinforcing the locks, setting up simple traps and barricades, and moving heavy objects near the doors and windows to make it harder for anyone to enter unnoticed. I didn't venture far from the cabin, just enough to gather firewood and make sure there were no other signs of recent activity. The hours passed slowly, with every small sound keeping me on edge. I noticed subtle signs that something had been moving around the area. Broken branches, disturbed leaves, faint tracks that could have been human or animal. My imagination ran wild with possibilities, but I forced myself to focus on practical measures. I couldn't control what might be out there, but I could make sure the cabin itself was as secure as possible. The second night was worse. The noises outside started again, this time more persistent. Scraping sounds, thumps, and occasional dragging noises. I kept the flashlight by my side and a large metal wrench within reach. I sat awake for hours, listening and trying to stay calm, constantly checking the doors and windows. At one point, I thought I saw movement at the edge of the light beam outside. My heart stopped. I froze, watching the dark, and the figure or shadow moved again before disappearing behind the trees. I realized that waiting passively would not help. I had to find a way to get to safety if something went wrong. By morning, I was exhausted. My eyes were red, my body tense, my mind constantly replaying every sound and movement from the night before. I decided that staying another night was too risky. I packed my belongings as quickly as possible, making sure to leave nothing behind, and planned my route back to the main road. The forest was dense, and the path was uneven, but I moved as quickly as I could, constantly scanning the surroundings for anything unusual. Every snapped twig or rustle made me jump, and I kept a tight grip on the wrench, ready to defend myself if necessary. After several hours, I finally reached the main road, where I could see signs of civilization in the distance. My hands shook, and my legs ached from the strain and fear, but I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I stopped at the first gas station I found and called a friend to come pick me up. I explained what had happened in sparse, hurried words, careful not to exaggerate, but my voice shook as I spoke. When my friend arrived, I got into the car, and the sense of safety hit me fully. I looked back toward the forest, toward the cabin, and realized that while it had seemed peaceful and inviting at first, the isolation had made it dangerous in a way I had not anticipated. The experience stayed with me for months. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me, that the cabin had not been as empty as I had thought. But I also learned something important. I had survived because I stayed calm, because I thought logically and prepared for the worst, and because I didn't let fear control me entirely. It was a harsh lesson in self-reliance and the reality of isolation in the wilderness. I never returned to that cabin, and I made sure to avoid any remote rentals that weren't well secured or that didn't have at least some contact with the outside world. The memory of the dragging sounds in the night, the disturbed earth, and the feeling of being watched stayed with me. But I knew I had handled the situation as best as anyone could. I had survived, and that clarity, that hard-earned awareness, was my real reward from the trip. I had planned the trip for weeks, maybe even months, though I wasn't keeping track. The cabin sat in the mountains, deep in the woods where no one lived close by. I had found it online, a small, rustic place, isolated and quiet, exactly what I wanted. I was exhausted from the city, the constant noise, the unending pressure of work, and I thought a few days alone would reset me. I packed carefully, leaving no detail to chance. The car was loaded with food, water, firewood, extra blankets, and my survival gear. I had even brought a first aid kit I hoped I wouldn't need. I told no one where I was going. Not my family, not friends. I liked the idea of disappearing for a while. I wanted silence and I wanted solitude. The drive itself was long, longer than I had expected. The roads narrowed, the asphalt giving way to gravel, which in turn became dirt and rocks. The forest closed in, tall pines and oaks arching overhead, filtering the sunlight into long, sharp streaks. There was a faint smell of wet earth, moss, and decaying leaves. I remember thinking how the world had become suddenly different, slower, more deliberate, as if I had crossed into another reality entirely. Birds called occasionally, and the wind brushed through the trees, rattling the branches. At some point, I stopped the car to take a picture, though I didn't feel the need to share it anywhere. The light was soft, and the air had a chill that made my cheeks tingle. My pulse was calm, but there was a low hum of awareness in my chest, a sense that I was entering a place where normal rules didn't apply. When I finally reached the cabin, I noticed how small it looked compared to the massive forest around it. It was made of weathered wood, dark from years of exposure, with a tin roof and a small porch that sagged slightly under the weight of age. The windows were dusty, and the door creaked as I opened it. Inside, it smelled faintly of mildew and wood smoke, though the cabin had clearly been cleaned recently. There were basic amenities: a small wood stove, a table, a couple of chairs, and a bed with clean linens. I dropped my backpack, letting it thud to the floor, and ran my hands over the wooden surfaces, feeling the ridges and grooves. The cabin was simple, rough, functional, and I felt a strange relief in its lack of comfort. It was nothing fancy, nothing meant to pamper. It was survival. It was being alone in a place that existed without interference. That was the appeal. I set to work unpacking. I stacked the firewood neatly near the stove, laid out my food in the small kitchen area, and opened the windows to let in the cold mountain air. The light was beginning to fade, and shadows stretched across the walls, long and dark. I found a lantern in the corner and tested it. The flame flickered, casting an uneven glow. I felt a thrill of self-sufficiency. I was alone, but I was ready. I had prepared. I was capable. It was a comforting thought, at least for now. That first night, I made a fire in the stove and sat watching it burn. The sound of wood cracking and popping echoed in the otherwise quiet cabin. I could hear the forest outside, the wind moving through branches, the occasional rustle of leaves. I told myself it was just deer or small animals. I had been hiking long enough to know the difference between a predator and a harmless creature moving in the underbrush. Still, there was a tiny knot of unease in my stomach. Darkness had a weight to it in places like this. The cabin felt like it was at the center of a giant, breathing world, and I was the only human in it. I drank some water, ate a simple meal I had brought, and tried to settle in. The wind gusted harder outside, rattling the windows. I imagined a storm coming, though the forecast hadn't warned of one. I wrapped myself in a blanket and slept lightly, half listening to the forest as if it might speak to me through the rustling leaves. Morning came, pale and misty, with low clouds brushing the tops of the mountains. I got up early, determined to explore before it got too hot. I packed a small bag with water, a map, a compass, and my camera. I left the cabin door open, thinking it would be easier to return. The forest was dense, the trees tall and close, their roots thick and gnarled. I moved carefully, stepping over fallen branches and around wet, moss-covered rocks. The air smelled fresh, earthy, alive. I walked for hours, following a trail that became faint, then disappeared entirely, leaving me to navigate by instinct and memory. My heart rate picked up occasionally when I heard sounds that weren't immediately identifiable. A crack of a branch, a rustle in the brush, the low call of an animal somewhere far off. I told myself I was careful, that nothing could reach me that I couldn't handle. Still, the forest had a quiet intensity, a patient watchfulness, as if it knew I was intruding into its world. By mid-afternoon, I returned to the cabin tired and thirsty. I made tea and sat on the porch, letting my legs dangle over the edge. The view was remarkable. Rolling hills, dark green trees, the fog clinging to the valleys like thick smoke. I felt small in a way I hadn't in the city. The isolation was no longer just a desire. It was real. It pressed against me, reminding me that I was alone, truly alone, in a place that was indifferent to my presence. That evening, I started another fire, cooked a simple dinner, and watched the flames. The wind had picked up again, more insistently, rattling the cabin walls. It was one thing to see the trees sway in daylight. It was another to hear them creak in darkness, knowing the branches could snap at any moment. I checked the windows, secured the door, and sat back. It was during this second night that things began to shift. At first, it was just small things. A sound outside the window that was too deliberate, too heavy to be an animal. I told myself it was a branch or maybe a deer stepping over rocks, but the pattern was wrong. There was a scrape against the siding, sharp and short, followed by silence. I held my breath, listening. The cabin seemed to shrink around me, the walls pressing in as my mind tried to rationalize what I heard. Every sound outside became amplified. Wind, branches, the forest breathing. I realized I hadn't thought about how alone I was in practical terms. There were no neighbors, no chance of immediate help. If something went wrong, I was responsible for myself entirely. I stayed awake for hours, flashlight in hand, checking every corner of the cabin. Nothing was there. Nothing moved except the shadows of the trees outside. I tried to sleep in fits, but every noise woke me. I couldn't explain the scraping sounds outside. I didn't see footprints in the dirt near the cabin in the morning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. I tried to convince myself it was paranoia, that being alone for so long was playing tricks on my mind. I tried to rationalize, to remind myself that nothing could enter the cabin without making more noticeable noise. I inspected the doors, windows, and even the chimney. Everything was secure. By the third day, I was exhausted. Sleep deprivation had a way of sharpening awareness and warping perception at the same time. I went for another hike, this time taking a longer, more isolated trail. I carried my knife in its sheath, my water, and extra supplies. The forest grew denser the further I went, the trees closer together, the light dimmer. I noticed signs of animals. Claw marks on trees, scat, broken branches. My steps slowed as I paid attention to every sound. Then I heard it, a soft crunch not behind me, but ahead. Someone or something was moving deliberately in the same direction. I froze, my heart pounding. I stayed still, hoping it was just a deer, but the rhythm of the footsteps didn't match anything natural. They were too measured, deliberate. I ducked behind a large tree, pressing against the rough bark, holding my breath. The sound passed, moving closer, then receding. I returned to the cabin that evening with a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. I double-checked the locks, stacked more wood against the door just for peace of mind, and inspected the windows again. I realized I was in a dangerous situation. I was alone in a remote area with someone else, maybe a stranger, close by. The realization was sobering, grounding, and terrifying at the same time. My confidence from the first night had evaporated. Survival now meant awareness, preparation, and caution, not just enjoying the forest. The next morning, I made a plan. I packed the car partially, leaving only essential items in the cabin, so if I needed to leave quickly, I could. I made sure the firewood and food would last in case I had to hide or wait out a day. I mapped the quickest route out on paper and marked all the potential hiding spots along the way. I armed myself with my knife and an improvised spear from a strong branch. I knew I couldn't rely on anyone coming to help. I had to be ready for anything. That afternoon, I noticed something new. Footprints, fresh in the dirt near the edge of the trees behind the cabin. Human footprints. I had been looking forward to that trip for weeks. The whole point of it was to be alone, away from the constant noise of the city, away from people, phones, screens, and even paved roads. I wanted silence, the kind of silence you can almost hear pressing against your ears. I booked a small off-grid cabin that I found through a listing online. It wasn't part of a campground, not part of a tourist area. It was one of those scattered, privately owned places deep in the woods that people rent out to anyone willing to make the long drive and follow vague directions. The pictures had shown an old wooden cabin, single floor, a metal roof, no electricity, and a small wood stove inside. The listing said there was a water pump outside and an outhouse 20 yards behind it. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive took longer than I thought it would. The last 20 miles were nothing but a single-lane dirt road with more potholes than flat ground. The further I went, the more trees pressed in on both sides, their branches sometimes scraping against the side of my car. I stopped once or twice to check the directions, and by the time I finally found the narrow opening that led to the cabin, the sun was already sliding behind the trees. The cabin sat in a small clearing with weeds grown high around it, like it hadn't been used much. The roof was streaked with rust, the walls gray with age. There was a single porch step, half broken. No other houses were anywhere in sight. No power lines, no driveways, nothing. Just endless trees in every direction. That was exactly what I had wanted, but standing there in person gave me a strange feeling. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more of a weight, like stepping into a place that had been still for too long. Inside, it was even smaller than it looked in the pictures. A single room with a narrow bed against one wall, a wood stove in the corner, a table with one chair, and a shelf with some old cans and jars. Dust covered everything. The air smelled stale, mixed with faint wood smoke that must have sunk into the walls over years of use. There was a single window on each side, all of them covered in thin film that made the view outside look blurred. I unloaded my bag and set it on the bed. I had brought some food, a couple of lanterns, extra batteries, a small first aid kit, and some clothes. The plan was simple: cook, read, hike, sleep, and repeat. The first night went by quietly. I lit a small fire in the stove, cooked some noodles, and sat listening to the crack of the wood. When the fire burned down, I stretched out on the bed. The mattress was lumpy, but I didn't care. The silence outside was thick. No cars, no hum of city power, no voices. Just the occasional sound of leaves shifting in the wind. The first thing that woke me was how dark it was. The kind of dark where you can't see the outlines of your hands in front of you. I sat up, listening. I wasn't sure what had pulled me awake. For a while there was nothing. Then I heard it. A crunch of leaves outside the cabin. Slow, steady, like someone walking carefully. I froze, my breath held tight. The sound moved across the front of the cabin, then stopped. I waited, heart pounding, straining my ears. After what felt like forever, I heard it again, just a single crunch this time, then silence again. I told myself it had to be an animal, deer maybe, or a raccoon. I lay back down, though it took a long time before I fell asleep again. In the morning, when I stepped outside, the grass was wet with dew. I walked a slow circle around the cabin, looking at the ground. Sure enough, I found tracks in the dirt. They weren't paw prints. They were shoes, clear outlines of boots, pressed deep into the mud near the porch. That gave me a sick feeling in my stomach. I tried to tell myself maybe it had been an old print from before, maybe even my own from when I first walked in. But when I put my boot into it, the print was bigger and deeper. Someone else had been there. I spent the day trying to brush it off. I went on a hike down the old logging trail behind the cabin. I carried a small backpack with water and snacks. The woods were dense, full of long shadows and the smell of damp earth. I didn't see anyone, not even far off. By the time I got back, the sun was already low again. That night, I sat at the table with a lantern burning low. I kept looking at the window, even though the glass was so hazy I could barely see through it. I forced myself to eat, then locked the door and lay on the bed. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, this time closer. They circled slowly around the cabin, crunching through leaves, pausing for long stretches. I lay stiff on the bed, staring into the dark, every muscle tight. At one point, something brushed against the side of the cabin wall with a faint scrape. I wanted to get up, to grab the lantern, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I just lay there, listening, heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. After what felt like an hour, the sound stopped. Silence fell again. When the sun finally came up, I barely felt like I had slept. My head pounded, and every part of me was tense. I went outside again, and sure enough, there were fresh tracks all around the cabin. They led from the woods, circled the clearing, and stopped near the window before heading back out. Whoever it was had been watching. I spent the rest of the morning sitting at the table, thinking through what to do. I had no phone signal that deep in the woods. The closest town was at least an hour and a half away, maybe more. My car was parked just outside the clearing, but the thought of driving that road in the dark wasn't appealing. I told myself I'd leave in the morning. One more night. All day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even when I walked to the outhouse, I kept glancing back at the tree line. The woods seemed too still, too quiet. That night, I built up the fire inside the stove so it would last longer. I kept the lantern close by on the table, ready to grab. I even sat with my boots on, just in case. The footsteps came again. This time, slower, more deliberate. I could hear the weight of each step, almost as if the person knew I was listening. They paused outside the door for a long time. My throat was dry, my palms slick with sweat. I stared at the door, waiting for the knob to turn. It never did. Instead, the footsteps drifted off, circling again. At some point, exhaustion dragged me into a half-sleep. When I woke up, gray light was filtering through the window. I felt a rush of relief that it was morning. But when I stepped outside, my stomach dropped. On the porch, in the center of the step, was a single object, a crushed cigarette butt. I hadn't smoked. That was enough. I packed everything in a rush, stuffing it into my bag without folding or organizing. I threw it in the car and started driving. The dirt road seemed endless, twisting through the trees, every shadow making me grip the wheel tighter. When I finally reached the main road, I didn't stop driving until I hit town. I pulled into the first gas station I saw and sat there for a long time, my hands shaking on the wheel. I thought about going to the police, but what would I even say? That I heard footsteps? That I saw boot prints? That someone left a cigarette on the porch? None of it was enough. It wasn't a crime. It was just someone out there, someone who knew I was alone. I never went back to that cabin. I never even asked for the deposit I had paid. It wasn't worth it. For weeks afterward, I kept waking up in the night, thinking I heard footsteps outside my apartment window. Sometimes I still do, but I always remind myself of one clear truth. Whoever it was out there in those woods, they knew exactly where I was. They knew I was alone, and they chose to come close. And that, more than anything else, is what keeps me awake at night. I had been planning this cabin trip for months. I wanted a real escape from everything. The city, my job, the constant hum of people and traffic. I had found a small, old cabin for rent deep in the woods, several hours from the nearest town. The pictures online made it look charming, rustic but not dilapidated, with a creek running nearby and a few scattered pines around it. I had my backpack ready, a week's worth of supplies, a first aid kit, canned food, a small propane stove, and enough firewood to last a few nights. My phone had a weak signal, but I didn't care. I wanted to disconnect completely. The drive there was long and monotonous, winding through highways, then rural roads, and finally a gravel path that dipped into the dense forest. I remember the change in temperature, how the air felt cleaner, heavier somehow, with the faint smell of pine and earth. Birds chirped intermittently, and the occasional rustle of leaves suggested wildlife moving unseen. By the time I arrived, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in pale shades of orange and purple. The cabin sat slightly off the main path, almost hidden behind a curtain of trees. It looked smaller in person, its wood weathered and dark, the windows reflecting the fading light. I felt a strange thrill of isolation, the kind that makes your chest tighten and your senses sharpen. The first few hours were uneventful. I unpacked my things, stacked firewood by the small stone fireplace, and set up the stove to boil water for dinner. The cabin had no electricity beyond a few battery-operated lanterns, which added to the sense of being cut off from the world. I noticed the silence most of all. It wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that made your ears itch, that made every snap of a twig or distant animal call feel exaggerated. I reminded myself that sounds were normal in the forest, just wind, squirrels, birds, maybe a deer or fox, and tried to focus on getting comfortable. That night, I slept fitfully. The wind picked up, rattling the cabin walls and the thin windows. At one point, I woke to a sharp, almost metallic creak, as if the floorboards had shifted beneath my weight. I froze, listening. Outside, the forest seemed alive, every sound magnified. Branches scraping against each other, the distant crack of a tree limb breaking, leaves crunching underfoot. I reminded myself it was probably an animal or the wind, nothing else. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted back to a restless sleep. The next day, I decided to explore the area. I wanted to get familiar with the surroundings and maybe find a better water source than the creek the cabin sat next to. I packed light, a small backpack with water, snacks, a knife, and my flashlight. The forest was dense, the ground soft with layers of fallen leaves and moss. I followed animal trails, though I stayed cautious. I didn't want to wander too far without knowing the way back. As I walked, I felt the first real tension of being completely alone. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, felt like it could be something approaching. My imagination ran wild, picturing all the ways a person could get hurt out here. Twisting an ankle on hidden roots, getting lost, encountering wildlife. Around midday, I reached a small clearing that overlooked a steep, wooded slope. The view was beautiful, but I noticed something odd. The ground was disturbed, flattened in several spots as if someone had camped there recently. There were remnants of a fire pit and scraps of burned paper. I examined it closely, but there were no signs of people still being around. My heart beat faster, though I told myself it was just a coincidence, maybe another camper who had left. I took some pictures and headed back, sticking closer to the paths I knew. By the second night, unease had settled over me. I felt watched, though I saw nothing. When I stepped outside the cabin to collect firewood, I thought I glimpsed movement just beyond the tree line. Something large, perhaps, but it could have been my imagination. The forest was dark and thick, shadows stretching unnaturally, and I felt a tight knot in my stomach. I carried a heavy stick, more for comfort than defense, and kept my lantern close. I reminded myself that predators were unlikely this close to a cabin, and humans were probably farther away. Still, every sound made me startle. Then, around midnight, I heard it clearly. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, not like a deer hopping or a raccoon rummaging. They weren't light. Each step pressed into the ground with weight. They weren't close enough to see through the window, but I could hear them circling the cabin. My heart raced. I grabbed the heaviest flashlight I had and approached the nearest window, straining to see through the darkness. There was nothing, only the black shapes of trees. I tried to calm myself, thinking it could be the wind, maybe a branch scraping, but the rhythm of the steps didn't match any natural sound. They were methodical. I spent the night sitting in a corner with my flashlight and a knife, listening. The steps came and went, sometimes close, sometimes distant. I didn't sleep. By morning, exhaustion had set in, but I had made a decision. I couldn't stay another night alone if this continued. I packed essentials, leaving most of my things behind, and planned to hike back to the road. During the hike, I stayed on familiar paths but moved quickly, my senses hyper-aware. Every crack of a twig, every snap, made me tense. I heard the distant sound of footsteps several times, but whenever I turned, nothing was there. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe someone was following me from the previous campsite. Maybe it was a local with bad intentions. I kept my stick ready, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. Hours later, I finally reached the gravel road. Relief flooded me, and I started walking toward the nearest town. My phone, which had a weak signal at the cabin, finally showed a single bar. I called the local authorities, explaining that I felt someone had been following me near the cabin. They took down the details and promised to send someone, though I doubted they would find much. Eventually, I made it to a small diner at the edge of town, sat down, and breathed. The adrenaline slowly faded, leaving an ache in my muscles and a raw awareness of how isolated I had been. The thought that someone or something had been tracking me in that forest lingered, a shadow that didn't fully disappear. I realized the danger wasn't in some fantastical horror, but in the very real possibility of another human with unknown intentions in a remote area. The authorities later told me that the cabin had been targeted before, that trespassers sometimes used it for temporary hiding spots or illegal activities. They recommended I report any further suspicious behavior, and I did. I never went back, and I never stayed in an isolated cabin alone again. Even now, I remember the forest vividly. The oppressive quiet, the way shadows moved just out of reach, the sound of footsteps in the night. I also remember the relief when I finally emerged onto the road, the sense of sunlight on my face after the darkness, and the knowledge that real danger often isn't supernatural. It's human, unpredictable, and all too close to home.